Snow was still clinging to the car roofs when Olivia Hartman vanished in the parking lot of Providence Hospital in Anchorage, Alaska, the city of 290,000 people, nestled right against the bone-chilling Knik Arm. A north wind slammed down that night, whipping thin sheets of ice and blanketing the entire lot in white like a winter burial shroud. Around 10 o'clock at night, a janitor spotted Olivia walking past the last row of cars, her silver coat catching the smeary yellow light in the thick, wind-heavy air. She was slipping her hand into her pocket as if searching for keys, moving slowly between two ice-covered vehicles. That was the last image anyone ever saw of her. The janitor stood frozen as Olivia's figure melted into the swirling snow, and the minutes that followed would haunt Anchorage for the next 30 years. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss the latest cases. Anchorage lay buried under fresh snow, the wind roaring in from Cook Inlet and filling the city with a low, metallic moan like cold steel scraping against itself in the dark. The parking lot's smeary yellow lights bled across the snow, casting distorted streaks that stretched over the silent rows of vehicles, each one coated in a thin glaze of ice that threw the light back up into the solid gray sky. The cars stood motionless like compressed shadows in the quiet void, only the cold itself moving in sharp gusts that swept across the wide-open space. Olivia Hartman, 25 years old, left the hospital after her shift, walking down the open-air corridor blanketed in thin mist. Fluorescent lights along the eaves cast small halos downward, and each step Olivia took left a brief white puff of breath that dissolved quickly in the air. She pulled her silver coat collar tight against the biting cold rising from the frozen concrete, her small frame swallowed by the long corridor and the empty expanse beyond. Strong gusts slammed against the walls, sending up sharp whistles mixed with the dry rustle of snow skittering across the ground and rattling against the metal bases of the light poles. Olivia stepped into the parking area, where no one else was moving. Each crunch of her shoes on the thin snow rang out sharply, amplified in the vast, frigid space. Her breath mingled with the white fog, dissipating only to refreeze instantly into faint streaks in front of her. The cars stood in perfect rows, windows clouded with thick white frost that dimly reflected her moving silhouette between the lines. Olivia's silver coat caught the light and made her stand out against the cold gray scene, a slow-moving patch of brightness threading between the dark vehicle shapes. At the far end of the lot, far enough away that her footsteps couldn't be heard, a figure stood motionless. Its shape was stretched and distorted by the lighting, impossible to tell gender, height, or which way it was facing. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the hard gusts, just existed silently like a dark smear blending into the night. Olivia reached into her pocket, pulled out something small like a scrap of paper or a key, then tucked it back in, the motion so gentle it was almost erased by the snow and wind. Her hair whipped across her face in the gusts, her silver coat flaring lightly then pressing tight against her body whenever the wind shifted. The snow began falling heavier, thick white swirls passing through the yellow light to form a trembling veil in front of her eyes. The footprints behind Olivia were covered over by the wind in mere seconds, the ground returning to pristine as if no one had ever passed through. She didn't linger at any point, just kept walking through the shadows between the rows, her body gradually obscured, then disappearing entirely behind the third row where the light no longer reached. A hospital janitor looking out through a fogged window saw Olivia's figure slide into that dark patch, the silver coat flashing once, before going out completely. No one saw her emerge onto the main exit path toward DeBar Road. When her family tried calling and got no answer, they assumed she was driving through the snow and wind. As the night deepened, the house remained wrapped in absolute silence. No door opening, no familiar footsteps. Unease spread through the home like another layer of cold mist settling over everyone. The family realized something had gone terribly wrong and decided to call the police. After the family's call, the first Anchorage Police Department patrol car slid into the hospital grounds, its tires crunching over the thick snow with a low, muffled sound that carried far in the cold air. Strong gusts ripped across the wide lot, making the canopies rattle and sending up metallic scraping noises as they clashed. The entire parking area was bathed in the smeary glow of sodium lamps, that tired yellow light making everything look coated in a hazy fog. Officers set up barriers, marked off the scene assessment perimeter, and designated the spot where Olivia was last seen as the central focus of the documentation effort. The fresh snow cover turned the ground into a blank canvas again, making it hard to preserve the shape of any trace, even the smallest scuff marks. A team of officers focused on documenting the parking lot's condition in that moment. The density of parked cars was still heavy, most vehicles carrying a cold frost layer on their windshields, proof their owners had left the hospital hours earlier. A few still showed streaks of melting snow on their hoods, suggesting some had departed not long ago. Those small details were noted in the scene log, even though every observation was extremely difficult to verify under the harsh weather conditions. In the far corner of the lot, an area of disturbed snow caught attention. The edges were pushed up into small ridges, stretching a few footsteps, without any clear pattern. The strong wind had distorted every mark, but the irregularity of the spot was still enough for officers to drive in stakes and flag it. The officer in charge of interviewing hospital staff brought the security guard out to the cordoned area. His face was tense when asked about Olivia's last movements. He remembered the flash of the silver coat, the figure walking through the lot and then disappearing between two dark rows of cars. No loud noises had been recorded, no running, no sudden engine start. The absolute silence of the winter night made the details he recalled feel fragile, as though the cold wind itself was erasing them from memory. Another officer checked the analog camera mounted at the edge of the building, a device that only captured blurry, underexposed images anyway. The camera lens was covered with a strange deposit, not frost, but as if something had been pressed against it and then blown aside by the wind. The stored footage showed only broken patches of light and dark. The fact that the camera captured nothing clear drew special attention, because that area usually had no obstructions blocking the view like that. The equipment was sealed for further evaluation, even though everyone understood the reliability of an old camera in conditions like these was already very low. While sweeping the snow surface under portable lights, two officers discovered two sets of footprints of different sizes. One was larger and deeper, possibly from a man's boot. The other was smaller and lighter, but the wind had already erased most of it, leaving only faint, uneven edges on the uneven snow. The spacing between the two sets didn't indicate a clear direction, but their simultaneous presence carried major significance. One officer quickly measured the depth and size before fresh snow could cover them again. Within just a few minutes, the smaller footprint had almost completely vanished, leaving the snow flat as though no one had ever stepped there. Officers checked the doors along the 3 rows nearest where Olivia disappeared. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no items left behind unusually. Each vehicle was a sealed, dark compartment shrouded in cold frost. Flashlights probed every door handle for any odd marks, but everything remained unchanged, cold, clean, devoid of signs of struggle or confrontation. No scraps of fabric, no dropped objects, no drops of blood. Those findings only reinforced one hypothesis. Olivia had not left the area in her own vehicle of her own accord. One officer voiced the first official assessment, his voice low and firm. The likelihood of abduction was very high. The scene characteristics pointed to an action carried out in a short time frame, with minimal noise and enough precision to leave few traces. This didn't fit an impulsive attacker or someone acting on sudden motive. No money scattered, no personal items abandoned, no signs of rummaging or chaos. All the indicators pointed toward a deliberate act, executed by someone familiar with restraining a victim in an extremely brief window. Another officer recorded every comment, sketching an initial scene diagram with suspicious locations. The entire parking lot, from the canopy rows to the dark corner where the snow was disturbed, was marked with reflective stakes. Each gust of wind set off metallic rattling that blended with the sound of pens scratching across the hard plastic clipboards of the investigation team. No explanations emerged among those details, only a compressed silence beneath Anchorage's freezing sky. The disappearance showed no clear signs of a struggle, but the absolute emptiness of clues made the officers even more convinced that a hand had acted here with strange preparation and confidence. The officers continued documenting every element in the lot, from positions where light was blocked to wind patterns that made snowdrift in one consistent direction. The hospital's normally ordinary area gradually became a map dotted with flagged points of suspicion, every tiny detail preserved in the cold. No one offered any wild guesses, but the overall atmosphere carried a clear realization. Olivia's vanishing bore no signs of randomness. The silver Honda Civic was found while it was still dark, the thin morning light of Anchorage seeping through the low buildings and spreading gray-blue halos along the road. Reporters hadn't shown up yet, the area still empty except for the steady rumble of patrol car engines and the crunch of snow being compressed under tires in regular bursts. The car sat motionless on the shoulder of a road far from the hospital, in a place with no connection to any of Olivia's usual routes. This stretch was rarely traveled in winter, tucked against a strip of barren land between two secondary roads with nothing about it that would make anyone pull over. The snow around it remained pristine, no footprints, no drag marks, nothing to suggest someone had stepped out of the vehicle. As officers approached the Civic, details on the exterior immediately stood out. The snow layer on the roof was thinner than on the surrounding road, as though the car had stopped not long before it was discovered. The headlights were off, but the glass still held a faint warmth, not enough to melt snow into water, but enough to keep the clinging layer noticeably thinner. Along the bottom edge of the windshield, there was an arc-shaped streak running from right to left, suggesting someone had wiped across the surface with a sleeve or cloth. The wipe was uneven, with spots leaving faint streaks behind, as if the action had been quick and not overly careful. This indicated someone had tried to remove some trace from the glass, though the exact purpose wasn't clear. Inside the car, the driver's seat was pushed all the way back, a position Olivia never used, according to descriptions from family and coworkers. The gap between the seat and steering wheel was much wider, enough for a taller person to drive comfortably. On the passenger side, the seat showed no signs of disturbance. The floor mats held nothing out of place, no stray papers, no scraps of fabric, no personal items beyond what belonged to Olivia. The entire interior felt excessively tidy for the circumstances of a woman who had vanished from the hospital without anyone seeing her drive away. The gear shift was in park, but the grooves beside it showed the lever had been pulled down to drive and then returned. The steering wheel was slightly turned, not perfectly straight as it would be if parked with care. The top of the wheel had a light rub mark, possibly from a glove or sleeve brushing across it. None of these details suggested chaos. Instead, they pointed to deliberate, unhurried control. The driver's door was unlocked, and the central lock hadn't been engaged. This ran counter to Olivia's habit of always locking the car the moment she left it. One officer noted that the interior lock showed no signs of being forced, meaning whoever was inside had opened the door themselves or exited without needing force. Nothing had been rummaged through, no purse opened, no papers disturbed. That level of order put the officers on high alert, because ordinary criminal behavior rarely maintained such control over a space. The rear of the car showed no collision damage, no hard skid marks, no unusual dirt streaks. The snow beneath the tires wasn't churned up, indicating the Civic had come to a gentle stop without hard braking. The way it sat close to the shoulder gave the impression of a driver experienced and skilled at handling a vehicle on snowy roads, not someone inexperienced or in panic. This led to the inference that whoever drove it was calm, capable, or accustomed to operating someone else's car. One officer swept a flashlight across the side windows, searching for fingerprints. There were no clear prints, only faint smudges and light drag marks as though the driver had worn gloves or deliberately avoided leaving traces. The exterior door handles were uniformly cold, with no warmer spots to suggest recent contact. The snow near the door hadn't been kicked up, showing the person who left didn't linger beside the car. Every small observation was carefully entered into the report, gradually building the first picture of someone else's intervention in the Civic's journey. The fact that the car had been placed in an unfamiliar location with no tie to Olivia's regular routes made its presence here the element raising the most questions. The adjusted driver's seat, the wiped windshield streak, the shifted gear position, and the tidy interior all confirmed that someone had driven the car with clear intent, not the confused actions of a threatened victim. There were no signs the Civic had been abandoned due to mechanical failure. Under the hood, the engine was warmer than normal for sub-zero temperatures, indicating the car had been running relatively recently. The gas level hadn't dropped much, suggesting the distance traveled wasn't long but wasn't extremely short either. All of it highlighted the abnormality. The car had been moved from the spot where Olivia vanished by someone entirely different. The area around the car remained quiet, only the wind pushing snow across the road's edge. That silence brought no peace. It felt like a cold cloth draped over everything that had happened before. The car sat in the middle of the snow-covered expanse. No witnesses, no sounds left behind, no explanations offered. It became the first anchor showing the case wasn't confined to the hospital parking lot. The Civic stood as stark evidence of a deliberate relocation, one that revealed the hand of someone who had no place in Olivia's normal journey. The wind from Knik Arm blew hard along the Port of Anchorage area, sending sharp whistles through the gaps between containers stacked into towering metal walls. The ground was covered in a patchy thin layer of snow scoured by the wind, exposing patches of gravel that had been dragged by truck tires. The Alaska morning was so cold that breath escaping from mouths turned instantly into white mist, dissolving the moment it hit the next gust. In that gray and empty scene, a group of cargo workers discovered a human figure lying motionless in the dark space between two large containers, a few dozen meters from the main cargo yard. When police arrived, the area was cordoned off immediately. Olivia's body lay on its side, half turned slightly to the left, her dark hair dusted with flecks of snow. The snow layer around the body was very thin, indicating she had been placed there not long before discovery. The silver coat was still on her, the edges showing a few small scratches. Not deep tears, but marks like snags from something hard while being dragged or moved across a rough surface. There were no claw marks, no typical injuries from prolonged resistance. Technicians noted clear, even, deep ligature marks around the neck, forming a continuous line around the windpipe consistent with direct, quick, and precise force application. Near the body's position, the ground showed no clear footprints. The strong overnight wind had distorted every outline, leaving only faint depressions that were hard to distinguish as human or just wind-piled snow. There were no long drag grooves in the snow, no skid marks, no heavy object displacement streaks. This led police to note that the body hadn't been dragged from a long distance. Whoever placed it seemed to have chosen a spot close to the gap between containers, where the light from overhead lamps didn't fully reach. On Olivia's coat appeared a dark oil stain. When touched, the oil had begun to congeal with the ambient temperature, but was still soft enough to identify its original properties. The smell didn't match the type commonly used in the port's marine handling equipment. Experienced people in the transport area said container system lubricant was usually lighter in color and different in texture, while the stain on Olivia's coat was darker, resembling oil used in fixed industrial machinery inside workshops. The stain was small, concentrated on the front and left shoulder, suggesting she had contact with an oily surface at another location before being brought to this port area. Forensics recorded residual body temperature and the degree of stiffening in the extremities, estimating time of death not long after Olivia's disappearance. Blood had pooled and clotted in dense patches around the neck, without spreading far into the distant limbs. Physiological signs indicated she lived only a very short time after the attack. The nature of the neck ligature marks further supported that death came quickly and wasn't prolonged. When technicians examined the coat surface more closely, another find emerged. On the inner edge of the collar, two very fine fibers were stuck. One dark, one lighter. Both were so small they were only visible under handheld light at close range. Neither fiber matched the material of the coat Olivia was wearing. Each was collected separately into micro-storage tubes. In the technical conditions of 1995, extracting DNA from such tiny material was extremely difficult, but samples were still collected fully according to forensic protocol to avoid losing any chance for analysis. Investigators continued checking Olivia's hands. No foreign soft tissue under the nails, no long scratches, no bruising on the backs of the hands, all indicating she had no opportunity to resist during the attack. The pace of the perpetrator's actions showed high experience and control. Forensics noted that the injury characteristics fit a scenario where the victim was restrained in a standing or semi-standing position before collapsing. On the back of the coat, A thin strip of fine charcoal-gray dust clung in a narrow band. The particle form of the dust didn't resemble port area soil or sand. Based on experience, technicians suggested it could be dust from conveyor belts, industrial presses, or workshop ventilation systems. This type of dust typically comes from friction in fixed mechanical equipment. The presence of both oil and industrial dust on Olivia's coat created a parallel. Neither belonged in the port area, reinforcing the hypothesis that she had been at another location before being moved to the discovery site. The body had no major abrasions on the legs or arms beyond the direct fatal injuries, consistent with rapid restraint. The surrounding ground showed no signs of dropped objects, no personal items flung off, no drag streaks, no items fallen near the body. Every sign suggested the person who brought the body here deliberately kept the scene as clean as possible, minimizing visible clues. Technicians continued photographing, noting every angle, every point of contact between the coat and ground. Pictures from multiple directions captured the body's pose, clothing condition, natural bend of elbows and legs to determine if there had been post-mortem movement. No signs the body had been repositioned multiple times. The placement in the narrow gap between containers made it hard for anyone passing by to notice unless looking closely, especially in foggy weather conditions. The location was isolated enough for the act to occur unnoticed. The tall, stacked containers created dense shadows in the middle, blocking sightlines from trucks on the main route. Most noise was diluted by the wind. Officers noted the choice of this spot wasn't random. Whoever brought the body here seemed to know the area well, knew the least trafficked places, and knew times when few vehicles were active. Once sample collection at the scene was complete, evidence was placed in special sealed bags. The 2 fibers from the collar, the oil sample from the coat, the charcoal-gray dust patch, and small cellular samples from fabric edges were each coded separately. One technician attempted a preliminary DNA run, but the material quantity was too low for the equipment to yield identification results. The samples were therefore cold stored for potential deeper analysis, using methods appropriate to the technical conditions of that era. The port area was left with only the sound of wind and echoing metal as the forensics team departed. Olivia's body, the strange oil, the strange dust, and the highly irregular discovery location formed the first pieces of a clearly deliberate sequence of actions. No single detail was enough for a conclusion, but every trace carried the characteristics of behavior executed with precision and knowledge of how to limit leaving evidence. The port area was sealed off for many hours after the body was removed. Patrol officers continued checking the list of people present in the area during the most recent time frame. A stevedore from the overnight shift was brought to a temporary interview room right at the port. He appeared confused when told a body had been found near his work area. Time clock data showed he left his shift at 11 o'clock at night and was in the warehouse area opposite the body's location, around the time corresponding to Olivia's disappearance window. This made him the first person placed squarely in the investigator's focus. When cross-referencing travel times, co-worker statements, and warehouse camera logs, the entire timeline, from when he left the loading zone to when he exited the port after his shift, aligned perfectly with the assessment that he never passed through the container area where the body was discovered. There was no indication he had any opportunity to access that spot. His clothing also showed no oil, charcoal dust, or any particulate matching samples taken from Olivia's coat. The perfect match between timelines and statements quickly eliminated suspicion against him. Meanwhile, the forensics team attempted to recover the shoe print photographed at the container's edge. The print had been very faint due to wind erosion, but initially clear enough to capture and analyze. However, the negative film roll used for the scene photos was defective, causing the developed images to come out blotchy and unable to retain the original outline shapes. The shoe print lost all comparative value entirely. This mishap eliminated one of the few clues that could have pointed to a clear investigative direction. No way remained to determine exact size, step direction, or sole type. Attempts to restore the image with the era's techniques yielded nothing. Near the container area, police encountered a homeless man rummaging through a trash bin for food. His presence close to the body discovery site led to him being detained for questioning immediately. He wore an old coat with a mismatched oil stain on the shoulder, raising suspicion. However, the oil sample from his coat didn't match the type found on Olivia's. Upon closer inspection, he explained the stain came from a bottle of cooking oil he had spilled earlier. This was confirmed by the completely different smell, not industrial oil at all. His coat showed no scratches or material traces matching the charcoal gray dust from the body. The man was questioned further about anything he saw that night, but his account only revolved around looking for a place to sleep and huddling between bins to escape the wind. Nothing indicated he had been near the body during the critical time. After a few hours, police had to conclude he was not involved. An internal report from a young investigator was logged in the presentation notebook suggesting Olivia did not die at the port. Based on the nature of the oil and dust found on her coat, combined with the strangely clean area around the body, the report clearly stated the possibility that the victim had been brought to the port solely to dispose of the body. It further noted that similar locations in other Anchorage industrial zones had oil and dust much closer in match to the samples from her clothing. However, lacking strong enough evidence to pinpoint another specific site, the report was deemed speculative and set aside. The main investigative team officially continued focusing on the port area. The initial investigation shifted to checking night shift workers within range of the port, from container truck drivers, stevedores, to cold storage security personnel. Each had to account for their whereabouts, what they saw, and whether they left their work post around the time the body appeared. Most on the list had exit logs, timesheets, or co-worker confirmations that they hadn't left their stations. A container truck parked in the opposite area was thoroughly inspected. Its tire tracks didn't match any around the body. The cabin step had only ordinary dirt dust, no oil marks or signs of tampering. Inside the cab, nothing related to Olivia was found. One officer noted that if this truck had been involved, it would surely have left more obvious traces in the thin snow conditions. Despite questioning many personnel, no data produced a new lead. All pieces remained disjointed, and only suggested the port was where the body was left, not where everything began. Still, without direct evidence to expand the scope, the team had to circle back to hypotheses centered on the port. The questions remained unanswered. How did the victim reach the port? Why was she placed in that spot? And who had the ability to bring her to an area so deserted during thick wind and fog? The more interviews progressed, the more the investigative group recognized the scarcity of traces. No unusual noises were reported by drivers or night shift workers. No vehicle left the port abnormally during the key window. No headlights from a car were seen in the container area where the body lay. All nighttime activity appeared normal for Anchorage winter, where wind and darkness swallowed most sounds. These factors pushed the early investigation into a difficult direction. Some investigators kept focusing on port workers out of inertia, even without supporting evidence. Others tried to follow the internal report's hint that Olivia had been somewhere else before the port. However, no new physical evidence reinforced that view. All analysis stayed confined to what was recovered at the body site: the loss of the viable shoe print, the clearance of the night shift employee, and the homeless man, along with the dismissal of the warning that the scene might not be the original crime scene, sent the investigative path off course right from the start. Details seemed to contradict one another, each fragment pointing in a different direction. In the thick atmosphere created by the absence of evidence, the case began turning into a maze whose entrance had been wrong from the very first steps. The evidence storage room at Anchorage Police Department headquarters stayed lit all night. When Olivia's case file was transferred for classification, the technician responsible reviewed every piece of evidence from the parking lot scene to the port area. One of the first sample boxes opened was the DNA kit from Olivia's coat. As soon as it was placed on the stainless steel table, the seal tape on the box edge immediately drew attention. The adhesive didn't align perfectly. The tape line was offset by a few millimeters from the designated position. The edge of the tape was slightly wrinkled, and at one small corner, there was a fold mark showing someone had peeled it up once and resealed it. The technician examined it under a magnifying glass. Beneath the adhesive layer was a faint, tiny scratch, barely visible to the naked eye, but enough to prove the box had been opened. There was no note authorizing reopening, no supervisory signature confirming it. This discrepancy couldn't come from ordinary oversight, because DNA kits were always sealed under strict protocol. Such an error directly affected the chain of custody integrity. It was impossible to determine what had happened in the time between sample collection and storage. When moving to evidence bag number 4, the one holding the fabric swatch cut from the shoulder edge of Olivia's coat, another irregularity appeared. The label on the outside of the bag showed 2 layers of ink. The original black ink was fainter and positioned slightly lower, crossed out with a thin line. Above it was a new line written in blue marker, recording the exact same code as the original but with noticeably different stroke style and ink density. The new pen stroke still left a faint oily sheen under the light, indicating it had been written close to the time of this review, not matching the collection date. There was no reason to replace a label without noting the change. Tampering with an evidence label outside procedure meant this item no longer guaranteed a complete chain of custody. This raised a serious question. Who had authorized access to the evidence bag during that period, and for what purpose? An important forensic document that should have been in the file was also missing from the main case folder. According to the initial inventory, at the time the body was collected, a form documenting the particle structure of the dust adhering to the victim's shoulder and back had been created. But when the entire file cabinet was searched, that analysis form wasn't in its usual sorted position. Investigators tried looking through related document sets, but the form didn't appear anywhere. The only remaining reference was a brief summary description in the compiled report, not the full analysis. One member of the scene team remembered signing the original analysis form and confirmed the document had existed. Its disappearance made everyone understand it hadn't been lost by chance. Inside the storage room, the atmosphere grew heavy. Every piece of evidence rechecked carried a small but significant anomaly. Some evidence bags had the correct old-style seals, but the confirming signature at the bottom edge was misaligned from its usual spot. One bag containing gravel and soil from around the body had its code written in 2 different pens. No bag showed obvious signs of being opened, but each individual detail displayed an inexplicable lack of consistency. None of it was enough to prove evidence had been altered, but it was enough to create suspicion that someone outside protocol had interfered. When the lead investigator reviewed the chain of custody notes, another issue became clear. The recorded times when evidence was transferred from the port to storage showed an abnormal discrepancy in the logs. Some items were logged as arriving at 3:10 a.m., but the receiving officer's signature was time-stamped 4:05 a.m. The nearly 1-hour gap wasn't explained by any reason. This time discrepancy in the chain made verifying evidence preservation much harder. There was no continuous surveillance camera in the storage room to cross-check, because the monitoring system at that time mainly covered the main hallway. Each small error led to a major conclusion. The evidence had not been kept in pristine condition. When a case relied almost entirely on physical and forensic traces, evidence no longer guaranteeing an intact chain severely limited investigative directions. The lead investigator realized the inconsistencies in the evidence bags and improper seal marks weren't mere administrative mistakes. The probability of a string of basic errors occurring consecutively in the same case was extremely low without human intervention. The anomalies in the evidence room began forming a disturbing pattern. The DNA kit opened against regulations. The label replaced with different colored ink. The analysis form vanished from the file, all pointed towards someone deliberately obscuring traces. The purpose could have been to prevent accurate investigative leads, or to conceal information the evidence contained. The successive discoveries of discrepancies forced the investigative team to accept that the case was no longer purely about identifying the perpetrator and motive. Interference with evidence signaled a different level of complexity, where not only the victim's body had been moved, but also related information had been manipulated to disrupt the ability to reconstruct the truth. Each anomaly made the case deviate from the typical homicides Anchorage police usually encountered. There was a hand intervening in the investigation process right from the beginning. The evidence collected from the port scene and the hospital parking lot still sat in the storage cabinets, each sample coded according to regulations, but every attempt at analysis hit insurmountable limits. The amount of DNA recovered was too small, the fibers too fine, the oil stain and dust layer lacking sufficient characteristics to trace origins with the available forensic technology. Forensic technicians tried repeating the sample extraction process multiple times, attempting to boost reaction sensitivity, but the results stayed at a molecular level too low to build any identification profile. Lab reports repeatedly recorded the same cold conclusion: insufficient biological material to proceed with analysis. Each report acted like a frame, sealing off a fading investigative path. With no DNA profile, no usable fingerprint data, no intact shoe prints, and no camera footage, the entire case lacked the scientific foundation to move forward. The oil patches and dust recovered from Olivia's coat remained in a dedicated drawer, but they couldn't be analyzed further. Those samples became preserved evidence that couldn't be utilized. Parallel to the deadlock in the lab, field investigators gathered no additional information either. No one saw Olivia's car moving toward the area where it was found. No one heard unusual noises near the port. Port shift workers were interviewed multiple times, but their statements never changed. Roads around the hospital produced no later witnesses. Every effort to solicit more information through community channels brought no new leads. A few years passed. The file stayed open but saw no significant updates. Personnel who had directly examined the scenes transferred or retired. New investigators receiving the file only found a disjointed series of notes that couldn't connect into any clear direction. Both the hospital parking lot and the port area remained on the list of related locations, but every prediction lacked verifiable basis. Clues like industrial oil or charcoal gray dust didn't match any identified site, leaving the search for where Olivia had been before the port at a dead end. As the first years of the case slipped by without results, the file began receiving less mention in regular meetings. New cases arose, resources were limited, and priority went to cases with higher solvability potential, gradually pushing Olivia's file to the bottom of the follow-up list. Young investigators just entering the field only heard of the case as a difficult one layered in vagueness, lacking evidence, and without witnesses. They read through the pages and closed the file with a sense that there was nothing solid to grasp. Inside the storage room, cabinet number 4, second drawer from the bottom, the file box coded 95OH2274 sat mixed among hundreds of others. Over the years, a thin layer of dust began covering the box surface, the evidence bags placed directly beneath, each wrapped in cold preservation nylon, still bore the original seals that had been replaced with different colored pen strokes. After a long time, no one mentioned that anomaly anymore. It rested quietly in silence, like a part of the case left behind that no one could string together. During occasional cold case reviews, Olivia's name appeared on lists recommended for re-examination, but the file was quickly dropped from priority groups due to a lack of scientific data to exploit. No technology at the time could clarify weak DNA samples, so the case was deemed to lack sufficient grounds for reopening. The absence of investigative anchors left it noted with a short line: insufficient elements to continue. Investigators who had worked the case still remembered the evidence irregularities: improper seal tape, replaced bag labels, missing forensic reports, but no one had authority to confirm whether those irregularities tied directly to the perpetrator or were simply internal technical issues. There was no proof pointing to who opened the DNA kit or why the evidence bag label was rewritten. Thus, the biggest questions of the case remained unchanged from day one. Where did Olivia go between leaving the hospital and being brought to the port? Who drove the Civic, and was the body placed directly at the container yard, or had it passed through other locations first? Time stretched on, fading the already sparse witness memories even further. The homeless man questioned had left Anchorage. The stevedore was reassigned to another area. The hospital security guard moved to a different facility. Each witness, when asked again, recalled only vaguely, lacking the precision needed for a breakthrough. Relying on human testimony became pointless in a case where every critical detail hinged on physical traces. The more years passed, the deeper the file receded into the storage system. Paper documents yellowed slightly with age, page corners curling from humidity. Case number 95, OH2274, gradually became a familiar code in the cold case list that everyone knew but few understood in detail. It wasn't featured in training sessions or exemplary reports, only mentioned in passing during periodic reviews as a case hard to rediscover direction for. In the silent space of the storage room, boxes stacked on top of one another, each holding a frozen story. Olivia's box sat there too, unopened, unupdated. Only the thin dust growing thicker over time. From a case that shocked, due to its strangeness, it became a motionless paper file, lacking the weight to draw anyone's attention. Time flowed on, and the case slipped into the orbit of hundreds of other unsolved matters. No technology could analyze weak DNA samples. No new witnesses emerged. No evidence was recovered. When new investigators read through the file, they saw only a case without foundation to continue. No one objected to moving it into the cold case section. Everyone understood it wasn't because the case lacked importance, but because it no longer had conditions to expand. File 95OH2274 was finally placed on the third iron shelf, next to other files from the 1990s. Dust continued settling on the box edges, growing thicker day by day. No sound disturbed the storage room. No page was turned again. The case sank into prolonged stillness, as though everything that had happened existed only in the cold sheets of paper resting in the darkness between rows of metal cabinets. During a routine review at the cold case unit, the case coded 95OH2274 appeared on the screen in the list of the longest forgotten files. The file box was pulled from the lower shelf, where decades-long unsolved cases were kept in silence. When the box was set down on Detective Alyssa Crane's desk, a thin layer of dust rose in the pale neon green light of the analysis room. She opened the box, pulling out each old stack of papers, the yellowed reports, and the evidence bags frozen in time. Alyssa read the 1995 forensic summary, then opened the bag containing Olivia's silver coat. The smell of old nylon mixed with the cold scent of storage. When cross-referencing the report descriptions with the coat's actual condition, she noticed mismatches. The report stated the coat had no clear oil marks, yet on the left shoulder, the dark oil stain was still visible to the naked eye, despite the passing years. The charcoal gray dust clinging to the back hem was also not described in the analysis section, even though it was an obvious trace. The differences between the description and the evidence made her pause her pen and stare longer at the faded handwriting on the report page. She opened the DNA kit collected from the coat. The seal line was offset, the adhesive wrinkled, and the paper edge underneath showed a faint scratch. The inner evidence bag label also bore 2 layers of ink. The original black was crossed out with a thin line, and above it was the same code number written in blue pen. This sign matched the irregularity notes stored in the evidence custody log, leading Alyssa to realize the interference could not be explained by simple administrative error. When checking the document list, she saw the charcoal dust analysis form was numbered in the inventory but not present in the file. The form's code still appeared in the index, proving it had once existed. The surrounding pages carried consecutive numbering, creating a strange gap where the analysis form should have been. No paper clip mark, no tear, just an unexplained empty space. Alyssa laid out each piece of evidence on the steel table, arranging them in the order collected in 1995. She observed the tiny fibers preserved in microtubes for a long time. Though technology at the time couldn't analyze them, the samples remained in good condition thanks to specialized cold storage. The fibers showed no decay, no deformation. Under the light, they glinted faintly, as if still holding part of a story no one had ever heard. The DNA kit, the coat, the oil stain, the gray dust, all pointed to a simple possibility. The evidence still held value, if analyzed with new generation techniques. While re-examining the entire file, Alyssa noticed the 1995 report stated it was impossible to determine when the body was placed at the port, yet, based on the oil and dust, which did not belong to the port area, the initial report should have addressed the likelihood that the victim had been at 2 different locations before being brought to the port. However, the conclusion abruptly dismissed this direction, without scientific reason. That drew her attention to a handwritten note in the margin of an old investigator's document that once mentioned 2 points of physical contact from non-matching sources. Alyssa flipped back through the 1995 scene examination report, reading every section carefully, Every small detail, from the oil stain color description to the ligature marks on the neck, showed the perpetrator was experienced with rapid attacks. Yet the report failed to explain why there were no drag marks at the port, and why charcoal gray dust was present on Olivia's coat. If the body had only been at the port, where did that material belong? The report's omission of basic questions made her suspect part of the content had been blurred or rewritten to reduce the scene's complexity. Each page of the file deepened Alyssa's recognition of the case's abnormal nature. The combination of breached seals, changed bag labels, missing analysis forms, and contradictions in the forensic reports made it impossible to view this as a case of simple errors. The nature of the evidence interference suggested someone wanted to block the correct investigative path from the moment the crime occurred. In an internal cold case unit meeting, Alyssa presented the contradictions she had uncovered. The other officers looked at the rephotographed evidence with disbelief. When she placed the two evidence bag labels on the table for comparison, the difference between black ink and blue ink stood out clearly under the meeting room lights. No one had reason to replace a label without noting it in the file. That was procedure every member understood. The irregularities were no longer isolated points but a consistent pattern of interference. The meeting ended with Olivia's file being added to the priority list. Alyssa was assigned to re-examine all evidence, contact the advanced lab, and arrange reanalysis of the DNA fibers and oil stain using current technology. From its motionless place in the darkness of the steel shelf, the case returned to the cold case team's desk with its true weight. Every piece of evidence, every report, every overlooked detail was brought back into re-evaluation. The workroom lights reflected off the metal table where Alyssa placed the old DNA kit beside new generation analysis equipment. In that moment, the file notes, the oil streaks, the charcoal dust layer, and the ligature marks on Olivia's neck were no longer scattered data. They formed a mysterious structure she was determined to unlock with tools the investigation years earlier could never have possessed. In the lab, cooperating with the cold case unit, two ultra-small sample tubes containing material collected from Olivia's coat were placed under specialized lighting. Technicians began the extraction process using next-generation equipment, focusing on each nearly invisible biological trace preserved through more than 2 decades under the blade of time. Each molecule was pulled out using targeted amplification techniques, then fed into the sequencing system. The machine ran for hours, its steady fan hum blending with the rhythmic electronic sounds. When the first sequence appeared on the screen, the silence in the lab grew thick, as though the entire room held its breath with every character that emerged. The first DNA sample, taken from the dark fiber in the coat collar, began forming a distinctive structural sequence. The results were run through the lab's genealogical matching platform, where the database included not only criminal records, but also genetic data from hundreds of thousands of civilian profiles. As the equipment completed the process, Alyssa stood beside the control station, watching the genetic markers light up on the chart. When the list of matching surnames appeared, the name Caro was highlighted with the highest compatibility score. The technicians expanded the analysis, cross-referencing against genetic maps of families residing in Alaska over many decades. The family tree suggested the DNA sample matched a branch of the Caro family scattered across the Palmer and Wasilla areas. This family had multiple members active in skilled labor, private security, and machinery operation. Civil records showed some family members with prior convictions related to violent behavior and conflicts. The genetic match strength was sufficient to confirm the DNA belonged to an individual in the direct lineage of the Caro family. Alyssa noted every detail. The locations of Palmer and Wasilla had no direct connection to where the body was found. However, the driving distance between Anchorage and those two communities wasn't overly far, and plenty of people from Palmer worked in Anchorage. This finding didn't prove the perpetrator's identity, but it indicated that someone bearing the Caro surname had direct physical contact with Olivia at the time of her death. While the first sample provided a clear direction, the second DNA sample from the lighter-colored fiber opened an entirely different path. This sample had fewer biological molecules, but was still sufficient for amplification after multiple cycles. When the results appeared on screen, the genetic sequence led to a different surname, unrelated by region, occupation, or lineage to Caro. That surname was Malloy. The name Malloy appeared with notable frequency in databases connected to Anchorage. The Malloy family owned portions of maritime transport routes and held stakes in a chain of warehousing operations around the port area. Genealogical data showed multiple generations of the family living in Anchorage and involved in the industry. The genetic markers from the DNA sample matched the closest branch of the family, confirming that someone bearing the Malloy surname or in their direct lineage had close contact with Olivia during the time relevant to the case. Alyssa stared at the two genetic maps displayed side by side on the screen. The Caro and Malloy families belonged to completely different worlds. One branch came from the working-class community around Palmer, tied to mechanical work, private security, and heavy labor. The other belonged to Anchorage's economically stable layer, managing assets and maritime transport business. There was no blood relation between the two families, nor any obvious social overlap. The simultaneous presence of two DNA profiles on Olivia's coat created a pattern that could not be attributed to chance. The technicians continued examining the attachment characteristics of each sample. DNA 1 showed traits consistent with someone who had direct bodily contact with the victim. Its position on the wind-exposed collar and the two coat edges suggested that person may have held or restrained Olivia in close proximity. DNA 2 adhered in the shoulder area, layered over dust and oil, indicating contact at a different time, possibly before or after the violent act occurred. The attachment pattern of the lighter sample showed no signs of struggle but resembled transfer from a sleeve or item belonging to someone standing nearby. When placed side by side, Alyssa recognized the action structure wasn't simple. One person from the Caro family was likely the one who directly inflicted the injuries leading to Olivia's death. The remaining sample from the Malloy family suggested a point of contact that didn't directly cause injury, but was sufficient to indicate involvement in the circumstances surrounding the crime. In the cold case unit meeting room, Alyssa presented the forensic results on the large display system. The two family trees shown side by side made the entire group pause to absorb them. Every seasoned officer and investigator recognized the extraordinary nature of two unrelated groups appearing on a single piece of evidence. The parallel presence of two DNA lines proved two different individuals had contact with the victim during the sequence of events leading to her death. The possibility of a single perpetrator responsible for everything was eliminated. Alyssa cross-checked the list of occupations linked to both family branches. The Malloy family's operation of maritime transport networks gave them access to the port area where Olivia's body was found. The Caro branch, with its emphasis on private security, driving, and machinery operation, fit the type of physical force documented on the body. There was no intersection point unless a connection had been created not by family ties, but by an agreement between two individuals. When the Anchorage map was displayed, Alyssa marked two locations: Palmer, where one Caro branch lived, and the Portside neighborhood where one Malloy branch owned property and conducted business. The two areas were dozens of miles apart, but connected by a major highway. That route fully allowed two unrelated people to meet if they coordinated a joint action. Back in her workspace, Alyssa reviewed the 1995 scene notes again. No drag marks, no prolonged struggle signs, no dropped items. The behavior had been quick, clean, and under clear control. The oil and dust on the coat matched materials found in workshops or industrial storage, not the port. The body had been placed in a concealed spot. The car had been moved and abandoned in an unfamiliar area. Every detail fit a pattern of planned action. With the two DNA lines appearing together, a natural conclusion emerged. This was not a spontaneous attack. One person carried out the direct act, and another person with different ties coordinated, assisted, or provided the target. The two DNA samples didn't specify roles, but they confirmed the simultaneous presence of two individuals in the chain of events. Alyssa opened the investigation notebook and wrote on a new page a short line: organized activity. Multiple individuals involved. Not random. The appearance of Caro and Malloy on the same coat of Olivia was no longer two separate clues. It was the intersection of two distinct entities. One branch held power tied to maritime transport. One branch was mechanical labor tied to the skill of applying force. Each branch held a role in a sequence of actions that the smallest traces of evidence recorded. Alyssa affirmed that the case did not involve only one person directly causing Olivia's death. The two DNA sources revealed a multi-layered criminal structure, where the violent act was merely the final part of a different plan. The combination of two unrelated families was a key indicator that the motive went beyond personal conflict. The line she wrote in the file was underlined twice, like a new milestone in the investigation. Contract killing pattern. When the list of members from the Caro branch in Palmer and Wasilla was compiled, one name appeared with notable frequency in temporary labor records and security clearance data: Graham Caro. Old records from security service companies in Anchorage showed he had signed short-term contracts with various units, including a brief contract with Malloy Transport, the maritime shipping company within the Malloy family's business network. This contract lasted a few months in the same year Olivia died, and Graham's work period aligned exactly with the time Malloy Transport hired extra temporary security personnel for several warehouse points. A copy of the security contract showed Graham was assigned to control vehicle entry and exit, monitoring cargo transport flows in an industrial warehouse located near the old road connecting Anchorage to Palmer. This was an area that frequently operated at night and used various types of mechanical oil for lifting equipment oil, with properties closely matching the sample found on Olivia's coat. Combined with the charcoal gray dust on Olivia's coat resembling dust generated in workshops with pressing machinery systems, the area where Graham had worked became the most fitting explanation for the presence of both materials. When Alyssa reviewed Graham's movement records from 1995, the pieces began fitting together. In his payroll data declarations, there were several weeks when Graham worked shifts extending into the early morning, corresponding to schedules showing he used the route passing through the area where Olivia's Civic was found. The timing of the car's appearance coincided with the hours Graham typically left the warehouse during weekend shifts. This coincidence became the first link in a chain of indirect evidence, not through statements, but through behavior recorded in his own labor data. Alyssa requested the records department to retrieve information on footwear Caro used during that period. An old 1995 report noted the shoe print discovered in the hospital parking lot was large, consistent with a male. Although the negative film was damaged, the preliminary measurement section remained. Size 11. In the temporary security company file, the uniform registration listed employee height and shoe size. The entry Caro Graham, size 11, stood out as a piece of information that had once slipped out of view. Shoe size wasn't standalone conclusive proof, but when placed within the structure of the remaining traces DNA, employment contract, travel routes, it became a crucial puzzle piece. As Alyssa examined Graham's background more closely, several past points made him impossible to overlook. Criminal records showed he had been arrested for disorderly conduct in a Wasilla bar when barely over 20. But released because the victim refused to cooperate. Another file related to an assault near where Graham lived at the time, but insufficient evidence for prosecution. People who knew him described Graham as quiet, avoiding interaction, but prone to strong reactions when provoked. These traits couldn't conclude criminality, but they fit the profile of someone capable of brief, precise, non-prolonged violent acts. Alyssa moved on to checking Malloy Transport's internal security documents. The list of outsourced security personnel during that period showed Graham assigned to a particularly sensitive area, the auxiliary warehouse behind the company's main route. This warehouse housed old mechanical equipment, saw little traffic, and used heavy industrial oil closest in match to the oil stain on Olivia's coat. Although no record showed Olivia ever appearing in this area, the material similarity couldn't be ignored. The deeper she examined the files, the more Alyssa saw the connection between Caro and Malloy extended beyond the employment contract. On one temporary payroll list, a handwritten note indicated small bonus payments to security personnel assigned special duties, but the payment code didn't link to any internal URL. Among them, the payment code next to Graham's name had been inserted in a different colored pen stroke, similar to the style of the 1995 evidence bag label change. This drew Alyssa's attention to the possibility that the two similar handwritten notes belonged to the same person. Graham also appeared on the list of individuals with access to Malloy Transport's peripheral parking lot, once a staging area for external vehicles before cargo moved into the port. This area was not far from where the body was found. With such access, Graham moving a civilian car like the Civic at night wouldn't attract attention, as night shift security frequently entered and exited that zone. Investigators continued checking Graham's address history. In 1995, he lived in a small house in Palmer, but worked extended stretches in Anchorage, often sleeping in the warehouse break room for convenience. On nights requiring travel, he commonly used the extended DeBar route, the same route and time frame matching where the Civic was abandoned. Fuel payment records at a gas station a few miles from the wooded area near Palmer also showed Graham's travel schedule aligning with the period of Olivia's disappearance. Another notable detail emerged when Alyssa found an incident report from an old co-worker of Graham's, who once complained that Graham kept a set of spare keys for technical rooms in the warehouse, even though it wasn't his official duty. These keys included access to the old mechanical area, where equipment generated charcoal gray dust matching the sample from Olivia's coat. Although the record didn't explain why he had the keys, it provided key data. Graham could bring a victim into any secluded warehouse area unseen before moving to the port. During the extended review, Alyssa obtained one more detail from Malloy Transport's activity logs. In the exact month of the crime, the company had several unusual payments to security personnel listed as off-contract support. One matched the time Graham was in Anchorage without being logged in the time clock system. Such payments fit descriptions of unregistered, unofficial tasks. When all the data was placed on the whiteboard in the meeting room, the face of a suspect emerged inescapably. A person with access to areas containing oil and charcoal gray dust traces, capable of moving a victim without drawing notice, with a history of violence, a labor connection to Malloy Transport, and movements matching the location where Olivia's car was abandoned. The DNA directly found on Olivia's coat collar also belonged to the Caro branch. Everything indicated Graham Caro was the closest, most fitting match for the role of direct perpetrator. Alyssa added one more line in the investigation notebook. Caro, direct contact behavior, capability for restraint, movement, and scene handling. The chain of data was no longer disjointed. It formed the clear outline of a man who once stood in the shadows of the hospital parking lot in Anchorage Port. A man who knew how to strangle a victim quickly. A man who could control a Civic and abandon it exactly where chosen. A man who once worked for a company directly tied to the Malloy family. A man bearing the Caro surname. A man named Graham. After Graham Caro was placed at the center of the file, verifying his old residences became a necessary task. A leaning garage on the edge of the Palmer area appeared on the list of places once owned by him. The garage had been abandoned for many years, its tin roof warped and bent, rotted wooden panels forming gaps where light sliced through in narrow strips. Inside, the smell of damp wood mixed with rusted metal. The cold concrete floor bearing faint old tire streaks like frozen patches of shadow. When the search team lifted each board and each damp cardboard box, they discovered a small compartment behind the pile of mechanical junk. Inside was a wooden box containing documents, its lid secured with a simple latch that opened without forcing. In the box lay a few scattered items, some messy handwritten notes, a piece of map marked near Anchorage, and most importantly, a thick envelope holding photographs developed using old film techniques. The first photos showed scenes around the hospital where Olivia worked. The shots were taken from a distance, behind a fence or from inside a vehicle looking out, each one covert. When the next photo was turned over, Olivia appeared, standing by the hospital glass door, her silver coat catching the light exactly as described on the night she vanished. The angle showed the photographer standing quite far away, enough to avoid notice. The scene was daytime, clear sky, no snow on the ground. The timing in the photo was certainly several days before the crime occurred. In other photos, Olivia appeared while entering the hospital, sometimes just her back, sometimes only the edge of her face. Some shots were from the parking lot, others from behind a row of trees near the pedestrian path. Though there was no sign she noticed anyone watching, the repeated images showed the photographer had followed her over more than a single day. This fit the preparatory behavior of someone trying to establish a target's movement habits. But following the series of Olivia photos was another one, a woman who looked like Olivia from a distance. Shoulder-length hair, silver coat, small build. But the clearly captured face was not Olivia's. Behind the photo was the corner of someone else's house. When the photo was held to the light, one of the officers recognized the location as near an office building in Anchorage, where Rebecca Mills worked in the 1990s. Rebecca had been noted in an internal Malloy transport report as the person responsible for reviewing certain unusual financial items. When the two photos were placed side by side, Olivia stepping out of the hospital and Rebecca standing in front of the office building where she worked, the superficial resemblance became obvious. From afar, the two women had similar height, similar cold-weather clothing, especially the silver coat both used. The distance and angle were enough to make someone unfamiliar or observing from far away easily mistake one for the other. Investigators brought the photos to the light room to check print tones and material similarity. The photos had been shot on the same type of film, with identical borders and perforations. This proved the same person took them. On the edge of one photo was a tiny black ink mark as if from a pen tip touching it, suggesting the photographer had marked a particular photo. No writing, no clear symbol, but the ink spot's position aligned exactly with the corner of Rebecca's photo. Alyssa arranged all the photos in chronological order based on light quality, weather conditions, and shadow lengths in the images. Rebecca's photos appeared earliest. Olivia's series came next. The shift in location and the way the lens turned showed the initial surveillance had not targeted Olivia. Olivia only entered the frame when she crossed paths with the route of the person Graham may have been following. The officers continued searching the wooden box and found a crumpled small note. On the paper was a short handwritten line, "Silver coat, 5 p.m., back entrance." No name, no address, no signature, but the word silver coat became a direct link to both Olivia and Rebecca. Someone may have requested identification of a woman in a silver coat on a specific schedule. If the note writer believed only one person matched that description, then Graham mistaking one for the other became a strong possibility. Alyssa turned back to Rebecca's photo. In it, Rebecca stood near the office building door, holding a stack of files. The light hit her coat, creating the same shiny reflection as on Olivia's coat in the hospital shots. Only one small difference. Rebecca stood upright, interacting with someone off-frame. Olivia walked quickly, often at shift's end. If the watcher relied only on coat color, build, and crowded staff setting, confusion wasn't just possible, it was almost inevitable from a distance. In the garage, beside the wooden box, was a crate holding Graham's old belongings. An old leather jacket, some car tools, a small tin box containing film negatives. When the negatives were held to the light, technicians confirmed all the found photos had been developed from the same roll. This showed the surveillance occurred over a continuous period. The roll contained many unprinted frames, but when held to light, the faint images were still recognizable. Shadowy figures in silver coats appearing repeatedly from two different locations, the hospital and the office building. Alyssa set the roll down on the table, gently holding the film edges to avoid damage. Each frame became crucial evidence. No one photographed a victim randomly over multiple days. No one kept film and photos hidden in a secret garage compartment, if it was mere coincidence. Every photo of Olivia showed deliberate attention, planned observation, and tracking. But Rebecca's appearance in the earliest photos shifted everything. Graham may have chosen the wrong person based on outward traits. The garage stayed silent, only wind slipping through torn tin panels. The photos laid out on the old wooden table formed two groups. Rebecca's group, the real surveillance target. Olivia's group, the person Graham captured on film when she overlapped in location and time with Rebecca's image. The two groups side by side weren't just proof of following. They were proof that the victim selection mistake began during the surveillance phase. Alyssa looked at each photo, the small traces clear under the light. This was the first evidence reflecting a truth. Olivia was not in the original plan. These photos showed she only entered the observation zone because she shared traits with someone else. And the person who took those photos was Graham Caro. When the name Rebecca Mills kept appearing repeatedly in the documents retrieved from Graham's garage, Alyssa began pulling up Rebecca's entire personal file from 1995. What emerged wasn't someone connected to Olivia, but someone directly tied to Malloy Transport exactly during the period when the company showed unusual expenditures in its financial system. Rebecca wasn't an ordinary employee. She was an internal auditor responsible for examining discrepancies in the company's cash flow. Her job description explicitly stated she was assigned to analyze off-contract support payments, precisely the type of payments where Graham's name appeared in the temporary payroll records. In the surviving internal reports, Rebecca had submitted 3 memos recommending review of suspicious expenditures. One of those memos carried the line, "Source needs clarification," attached to a list of accounts with irregular activity, including payment codes linked to outsourced security teams. That document made Alyssa view the garage photo of Rebecca in an entirely different light. Not coincidence, but the image of someone positioned at risk of being targeted. The next detail came from Rebecca's work schedule. She frequently went to the hospital parking lot near the office area when checking documents in the medical partner's archive for Malloy Transport. Her travel logs on those days showed she usually left the building around late afternoon, wearing her distinctive silver coat, the kind easily spotted from a distance, and strongly reflective under lights. That very coat was the feature that made Rebecca's garage photos almost identical in silhouette to Olivia on the night she vanished. When cross-referencing Rebecca's parking locations in 1995, old map data showed her usual spot was near the pedestrian path leading into the hospital, exactly where Olivia also passed on shift-ending days. The 2 turnoffs, one for medical staff, one for temporary auditors, were very close together, with both women sharing similar height, posture, and silver coats entering the same area around similar afternoon hours. Confusion became inevitable when observed from afar. The photos found in the garage made it clear. The shots of Rebecca standing near the office building were all taken from long range, low angle, as if the photographer deliberately avoided detection. The shots of Olivia in the hospital parking lot used the same perspective, as though the watcher always maintained distance and relied more on outward identifiers than facial recognition. Merely seeing a silver coat and a quick walking figure made the 2 women's silhouettes hard to distinguish, especially for a non-professional observer. Alyssa requested reopening Rebecca's work schedule for the week Olivia died. The logs showed Rebecca had a document review scheduled for the exact afternoon of the crime, overlapping with Olivia's shift end. However, Rebecca canceled at the last minute due to an additional request from the finance department. In that moment, only Olivia appeared in the parking lot wearing an identical silver coat and leaving the area in the same direction Rebecca normally took. These data points sharpened the picture. The watcher had targeted Rebecca, but a small last-minute schedule change kept her from appearing at the critical time. Olivia crossed paths exactly then, wearing the same coat style, stepping into the position Graham was waiting for. There was no indication Graham ever clearly knew Rebecca's face. None of the garage photos showed the photographer moving close enough to differentiate the 2 women. That meant the watcher relied entirely on distant identification, based on a description someone had provided. A woman in a silver coat, traveling the hospital-to-office route in late afternoon. When all the photos were laid out together, the investigative team noticed a key trait. Rebecca usually held a stack of files in her hand. Olivia usually carried a purse. But in many shots, Rebecca's hands were obscured behind the building corner, while Olivia stepped through the exact lit spot where Rebecca had previously appeared. Someone watching from afar wouldn't see small details, like how they held items just the outline of a woman in a silver coat moving along a familiar path. Alyssa asked the background team to re-examine Malloy Transport's internal documents. In one management report, Rebecca was described as the individual approaching expenditures requiring tighter control, unusual wording in internal files, because most reports avoided naming specific people. An old manager had even noted that Rebecca asked more questions than necessary during the audit period. These details didn't conclude any liability, but they created motive for a party with vested interests to want the audit stopped. The documents also showed Rebecca had no idea she was touching expenditures. Malloy Transport didn't want scrutinized. There were no signs she received threats. No records indicating fear or suspicion. She continued her work normally, unaware that someone was observing her from a distance, documenting her every movement for a purpose unrelated to her job. One piece of information from Rebecca's former colleague added a crucial puzzle piece. Rebecca once said she liked wearing the silver coat because it's easy to spot in the evening. The very factor that made her feel safe turned her into an easily identifiable target. When Olivia wore the same style coat and passed through the same area, the mix-up became completely logical in the eyes of a determined but unprofessional watcher. The collected photos on the table showed a direct path. Rebecca photos, Olivia photos, parking lot photos, hospital corridor entrance photos, each image connected to the next, forming a deliberate observation chain, not random, but a purposeful pattern of action. Alyssa wrote a short line in the file. Rebecca Mills, true target. She looked again at the photo of Olivia, the woman who only crossed paths at the right moment, stood in the right spot, wore the right coat. The surface similarity became the reason for a fatal mistake. Olivia wasn't chosen. Olivia was mistaken. The violence didn't stem from her. It stemmed from her stepping into the gaze of someone waiting for another woman. In the perpetrator's preparation sequence, Rebecca Mills was the starting point of every movement. Olivia was only swept into that path by chance, following the same trajectory on an Alaska afternoon, when silver coats reflected light the same way. The cold case unit's forensic team chose a night with weather conditions similar to the night Olivia vanished. Light snow falling, wind blowing diagonally from Cook Inlet across the space between the rows of cars, yellow lights from the parking lot, casting broken streaks of brightness onto the snow surface. By dimming the distant lights and preserving the snow's reflectivity, the parking lot image matched the 1995 file description: weak light, creating wide dark zones between parking slots, while reflected shadows stretched long, obscuring real human shapes. Forensics reconstructed the path that Olivia and earlier, Rebecca typically walked through. It was the intersection between two rows of vehicles, where the light only illuminated the right half of the ground. When someone in a silver coat entered this area, the hospital lights reflected off them more intensely than usual. From a distance, the silver color created a hazy glow effect, making facial distinction nearly impossible if the observer stood more than 15 meters away. The team set up the observation angle based on the photos found in Graham's garage. Strong wind turned the snow into a thin, drifting veil, adding visual noise, exactly the kind of conditions that easily caused a distant watcher to mistake targets. Technicians stood at the suspected position Graham used for observation, based on the direction of the photos capturing Olivia in the lot. From that spot, if a woman walked through wearing a silver coat, moving quickly with her head slightly down, her face would almost completely disappear under hair and shadow. When a stand-in reenacted the movements, what became clear was that even a slight shift in the observer's angle turned the figure into a blurred streak of light, with no defined features. This led the forensic panel to conclude that the viewing angle that night forced any observer to rely entirely on coat color and body shape, with no ability to use facial details. Olivia that night stepped into the exact intersection point Rebecca usually passed through at shift end. Rebecca had appeared in this area on multiple prior days, according to the garage photo data. Olivia overlapped that route for no special reason beyond shortening her walk to the car to avoid the strong wind in the open corridor. The position match made the mistake begin the instant she entered the half-lit zone. The forensic team marked Olivia's appearance moment in the simulation, only a few seconds for the silver glow to emerge. In that brief window, the observer simulating Graham's position had only two choices: act or miss the assumed target believed to be Rebecca. Forensics calculated viewing angles, movement speed, and light reflectivity levels, concluding there wasn't enough time to distinguish faces. The parking lot's weak yellow light combined with blowing snow obstructed vision, erasing every small detail. When reenacting the attack motion based on the 1995 traces, technicians selected a position matching the old compressed snow streaks described in the file. An approach from the rear left, following a path hidden from lights, could reach Olivia without drawing attention. Analysis showed that only 3 quick steps were needed for the perpetrator to close in. Stride length and speed fit someone with Graham's build. When simulating the strangulation method recorded on the body, forensics replayed the even circular ligature marks around the windpipe. Those marks indicated strong but brief force, with no defensive clawing. When the stand-in recreated the posture, the victim was held by an arm looped around the neck, pulled backward. This position matched the bruising described at the nape and the coat collar pulled askew. It also aligned with a perpetrator wanting to minimize noise and end quickly, exactly the behavior noted in that year's forensic documents. Forensics continued reconstructing the perpetrator's movement after the victim collapsed. Using 3D scene simulation, they determined the perpetrator could drag the victim into the dark gap between two cars in just seconds. Strong wind and falling snow erased footprints instantly, providing ideal cover for rapid concealment. When the reenactment images were placed beside real data, one conclusion stood out clearly. Everything happened too fast for the observer to confirm the identity of the woman in the silver coat. Under those lighting conditions, the perpetrator could not have seen Olivia's face before acting. Based on the simulation, forensics stated the mistake didn't stem from carelessness, but from the perpetrator being ready to strike the instant the silver-coated woman appeared at the exact spot he was waiting for. Technicians continued simulating the camera angles that captured Olivia in the garage photos. That angle precisely matched the line of sight that plunged the face into deep shadow. When Rebecca's image was inserted into the same scene, the visual similarity grew even stronger. Forensics concluded. From the perpetrator's observation point, Olivia and Rebecca were indistinguishable. During the attack reenactment, the approach direction, force application, and Olivia's drag position aligned with the oil stain on the coat, the oil type confirmed as one only present when the victim was pressed against a pre-oiled surface. This affirmed the victim was pulled into a tight, dark corner, very close to an oily object, not across open flat ground. The result tightly linked the behavior to the actual parking lot terrain. Forensics completed the simulation with a very clear conclusion recorded in the report. Target identification time under the lighting and weather conditions at the scene was under 2 seconds. Action was taken without any identity verification step. The mistake leading to death occurred in a time frame too short to correct. Alyssa read the simulation report again, cross-referencing every point with the file. Every detail matched the chain of errors. Poor viewing angle, identical silver coats, overlapping positions, indistinguishable timing, force application consistent with Graham, traces matching 1995. The case structure was rebuilt through mechanical and physical steps, with no vague random elements. The mistake wasn't intentional, it lay in the moment. Olivia appeared in the right place, at the right time, under lighting that turned her face into an unrecognizable shadow. In the final simulation run, forensics replayed the sequence. Silver coat silhouette footsteps in snow, quick-moving shadow darkness closing in. And with just those steps, the case shifted from a plan targeting Rebecca into a tragedy that mistakenly targeted Olivia in a few irreversible seconds. When Graham Caro's role was established, Alyssa returned to the financial data tables of Malloy Transport, where the shadowy expenditures had once made Rebecca Mills the target of an internal investigation. A series of cash transactions appeared in the 1995 financial ledger, recorded as special security expenses. The amounts were significantly higher than standard pay rates for temporary security. Cross-referencing dates, this payment fell exactly in the week Graham was absent from the time clock system but still appeared in the auxiliary warehouse vehicle control logs. The sum was withdrawn through an internal method, bypassing banks, creating a transaction trail difficult to trace. The approving signature on the expenditure belonged to Raymond Malloy, the eldest son of the Malloy family, and the person overseeing warehouse operations at that time. During the analysis of remaining documents from 1995, the investigative team uncovered an old fax preserved among unsorted files. The fax paper had faded, the text nearly illegible, but under the green light of the ink examination device, edited pen strokes became visible. The line, meeting, same location, confirmed task emerged, along with a contact phone number matching the one Graham used in his employment records. The sender signed with the initials R. M., a signature style, very common in documents Raymond Malloy approved. The fax had been reprinted multiple times before archiving, distorting many characters. However, the adjusting ink layer, the thin line drawn through part of the text, was not fax machine toner, but original pen ink, applied after the initial print. This type of intervention was typically used to obscure content before copying to a new version. It made one reality clear. Someone had deliberately tried to blur communication between Raymond and Graham. The records department continued retrieving old employee statements from Malloy Transport. In one disjointed note, an office worker provided information about an overheard hallway conversation. The person recounted Raymond mentioning getting rid of the nuisance when Rebecca began questioning irregular transactions. The statement was recorded in a marginal note but never included in the official report because the witness considered it mere frustration. At the time, no one thought he might mean it literally. When placed beside the cash transactions and the photo of Rebecca in Graham's garage, its meaning shifted entirely. Raymond Malloy held power in the company, the ability to conceal cash flows, and direct access to the auxiliary warehouse, where the oil and dust samples matched Olivia's clothing. He also stood to benefit most directly if Rebecca stopped auditing the improper expenditures. Internal documents showed Rebecca had come close to requesting a full audit, one that could expose Raymond's use of transport funds for off-the-books activities. Alyssa compiled all the documents into an analysis board. Cash transactions. Only Raymond approved. Amounts matching the period Graham worked off system shifts. Edited ink fax. Direct communication with Graham, sent just days before Olivia vanished. Witness account. Raymond complaining that Rebecca was digging too deep and referring to eliminating the nuisance. Motive. Rebecca was about to report a list of irregular transactions, including payments linked to Graham. The data chain formed a clear diagram. Raymond never appeared directly at the scene, but finance, communication, and statements all positioned him as the one with motive and means to hire someone else to act. Graham was merely the tool. Raymond was the one who decided the target, timing, and reason for the action. When Alyssa placed Rebecca's photo beside the financial documents, everything aligned. Rebecca wasn't just an auditor. She was the only person in the system who had traced the crack in the hidden payment network. She had no idea the files in her hands touched the most dangerous point of Malloy Transport. She also didn't know that her habit of wearing a silver coat of personal preference became the identifier that made her easy to spot from afar. Someone like Raymond, holding power in a large company yet leaving traces in the books, had every reason to stop Rebecca's investigation. And when Olivia, completely unrelated, stepped onto the exact route Rebecca took, Graham simply carried out the instruction. Identify the woman in the silver coat per description and eliminate. The mistake wasn't within the plan's scope, but it stemmed from the deadly similarity between the two women. In the cold case unit meeting room, Alyssa added one new line to the analysis board. Raymond Malloy. Origin of the contract order. Arrows connecting transactions, facts, witness statements, and motive converged at a single point. The person behind the case didn't just want to conceal financial fraud. They wanted to silence the one capable of exposing it. Raymond Malloy had every element for that role: power, finances, motive, and traceable contact with Graham. When the file had gathered enough weight to shift from investigation to action, Alyssa presented the report to the Anchorage prosecutor. From the strength of the DNA evidence, financial transactions, surveillance photos, edited facts, and witness statements, 2 arrest warrants were drafted simultaneously, one for Graham Caro, on charges of first-degree murder and corpse desecration, and one for Raymond Malloy, on charges of solicitation of murder and obstruction of justice. Both warrants were signed the same morning, placed in sealed envelopes, and handed to 2 separate teams. The arrests had to be kept apart. These 2 men had communicated through private channels that financial records made hard to trace. Any slip, even a short phone call, could cause both to disappear from Anchorage. Alyssa stood in front of the detailed operational board. Team 1 assigned to Palmer, where Graham lived in a house right on the edge of the trail. Team 2 assigned to the Malloy Transport Port area, where Raymond frequently went to check containers and oversee staff. 2 parallel tactical diagrams were prepared. No team was told the other's specific target except at command level. In the cold case unit office, the Anchorage map glowed red with marked points. Alyssa pointed to the auxiliary warehouse at the port and outlined the plan to plant recording devices. The technical team would slip into the small office near the bay shore and install narrow-range microphones aimed at the area where Raymond usually stood to make calls or meet staff. The devices could record without exceeding legal limits, since the warrants were already signed. The goal was to capture any actions Raymond took while waiting for the arrest team to move in. The recording wasn't meant to catch a confession but to detect any attempt by Raymond to contact Graham before being taken into custody. In another room, the Palmer Special Tactics team spread out the old residential map where Graham was known to appear. His weathered wooden house stood isolated, with only one access road. Blocking escape was feasible but risky, since no one knew what weapons might be inside. Graham had a history of violence and conflicts, so the plan required execution in a way that left him no time to react. One team concealed in the woods behind, one team blocking both ends of the trail, and an unmarked vehicle ready to close in at the right moment. Alyssa made the key objective clear. The two suspects must have no chance to warn each other. That meant the arrest timing could not deviate by even a few minutes. If Raymond learned Graham was about to be taken, he could delete data, destroy documents, or call a lawyer to erect legal barriers. If Graham learned Raymond was being arrested, he could flee into the Palmer woods or destroy remaining evidence in the house. The procedure was locked in 3 steps. Team Palmer takes position but holds action until the coded signal. Team at the port plants microphones, observes Raymond, waits for the moment he stands alone in an accessible area. Both teams execute simultaneously, no delays, no communication over channels that could be intercepted. As the tactical teams left the room, Alyssa looked at the photo of Olivia placed beside the case file. Every detail had led to this moment. Oil stains, charcoal dust, garage photos, edited facts, DNA samples. There was nothing left to theorize. Now was the time to take the 2 men who had once stood in the shadows controlling her fate. At the Malloy port, the technical team wore janitor uniforms to avoid attention. They pushed a utility cart past the corridor, wedging a fingernail-sized audio device into the vent slit above the office area. The device activated, audio feed transmitting to a surveillance van parked 3 container rows away. Every sound came through clearly. Footsteps, metal door slams, Raymond barking at staff over a delayed shipment. When Raymond stepped into the shadowed corner for a smoke, his repeated morning habit, the arrest team was already in position. No one rushed the signal. Catching him alone would be safer and less likely to alert surrounding staff. At the same moment in Palmer, the special tactics team crouched in tree shadows. Wind howled through the pine branches, masking their movements. One member spotted light coming on from Graham's door. The front door cracked open. Graham stepped out holding a cup of water and an old coat. His appearance forced the Palmer team to hold position. No early move until the simultaneous arrest signal arrived. In the surveillance van near the port, Alyssa listened through headphones to the microphone feed from the office. Raymond's voice came through. Even tone. Sparse words, he appeared to be reviewing delivery logs. Nothing suggested he suspected anything imminent. When he stubbed out his cigarette and turned back inside, the arrest team received the command. Prepare. At that exact moment, the coded signal from the Palmer team came through. Graham was leaving the house, heading toward his old truck. If he started the engine, the perfect arrest window would close. Graham knew the Palmer forest terrain better than anyone. A few minutes would let him vanish among the pine hills. Alyssa made the call. She spoke over the internal channel. Palmer team, execute. Port team, move in. At Palmer, 4 special tactics officers burst from behind trees simultaneously. 1 headed front, 2 circled rear, 1 flanked left to block the driveway. Graham had no time to react. His arm was locked in seconds, the water cup dropping to the frozen ground and shattering into ice shards. At the Anchorage port, 3 officers in light body armor advanced into the office area, moving straight to the corner where Raymond stood. He turned, just as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. A ledger slipped from his hand, pages fanning open, wind carrying several sheets toward the bay edge. The 2 arrests were separated by under 30 seconds. No warning, no chance to call, no chance to destroy evidence. Alyssa received confirmation from both teams. Both targets secured. Everything she had traced from the smallest traces had led to this moment. The double net had closed tight, and finally, the 2 men behind Olivia's death were separated, unable to shield or protect each other any longer. Graham Caro had barely felt the metal cuffs tighten around his wrists when instinct exploded like a cornered animal's thrash. He jerked his shoulders hard, slipped free of the first hold, broke out of the officer's grip, and bolted straight into the Palmer woods, at the speed of someone with nothing left to lose. The special tactics team pursued immediately, but Graham's figure quickly melted among the upright pines, where flashlight beams reached only a few meters, and the damp, cold ground blanketed in dry needles turned every running step into a muffled echo. A thermal drone launched within 10 seconds of his flight. The infrared camera swept across the canopy, picking up his body heat as a bright red hotspot against the frigid forest floor. Graham changed direction constantly, pressing tight against tree trunks to reduce his signature, ducking onto narrow paths where the ground sloped sharply downward, yet the drone stayed locked on his body's thermal trail, impossible to blend into the darkness. The pursuit team split into 3 prongs based on live feed data. One group cut across the trail, one pressed from the north, the last clung to the downslope, leading to a natural dead end the topographic map had already flagged. Palmer wind roared, carrying pine resin scent down the valley, while Graham's heavy, downhill breaths came in ragged bursts, white vapor clouds rising like smoke between branches. When he reached the edge of the drop-off, narrow dirt before the ground plunged into jagged rock, 3 officers had already closed the arc behind him. One officer kept distance and called out firmly but not loudly, ordering him to stop. Graham turned, eyes flashing a mix of panic and calculation, then looked up at the sky where the drone hovered like a glowing speck. He knew the run was over. After a few tense seconds filled only with wind and drone hum, he relaxed his shoulders, raised both hands, level with his ears, and spoke quietly. Voice cracked into fragments. "I thought it was someone else. I thought it wasn't her." 2 officers moved in, relocked his arms, forced him to the ground for control, then stood him up and walked him back along the trail to the waiting tactical vehicle. As he was pushed into the rear seat, his gaze dropped no more resistance, only the exhaustion of someone who knew escape was gone. One officer held the door open and began recording spontaneous statements. Graham started talking through choked breaths, sentences broken but each word distinct. "I was told. Woman in a silver coat. Late afternoon. Hospital." The officer asked who told him. And after a very brief silence, Graham uttered the name that made the entire radio team behind the observation glass freeze. Raymond Malloy. He described Raymond handing him cash, not a transfer, giving a brief description. A woman in a silver coat, parking in that area, leaving around shift end. He didn't know the target's name, only the description. He said he followed for several days, took photos to confirm. But that night the snow and yellow lights left him seeing only a reflected silhouette. When the officer asked why Olivia, Graham closed his eyes as if bracing against the memory impact and said, "She walked the right path. Right time, same coat. I didn't see her face. I just thought it was the one I was told about." He described the approach, standing in shadow near a truck, waiting for the silver coat to pass, applying the choke to eliminate noise, dragging the body out of the lit area, loading it into the vehicle, then moving to the port because he had access there and could dispose of it unnoticed. His words poured out not in rehearsed order but like an unstoppable stream of memory, the way people confess when they know everything has already been exposed. When taken to the formal interview room, white light glaring on the table, Graham no longer dodged. He placed both cuffed hands on the edge, fingers trembling slightly, and looked at Olivia's photo placed in front of him. Alyssa asked him to walk through the full timeline, and he did. Receiving cash from Raymond in an old garage, receiving the description woman in silver coat, surveilling Rebecca at the Malloy office, taking photos to verify, waiting at the hospital lot, mistaking Olivia on the snowy night, applying the quick choke as instructed, moving the body to the port, abandoning the Civic on the shortcut road near Palmer, returning home as if nothing had happened. The forensic team behind the two-way glass logged every word, every detail, confirming how closely his account matched the evidence. Ligature marks, charcoal dust, industrial oil, drag direction, abandoned car location. When Alyssa placed Rebecca's photo on the table, Graham glanced only briefly, but the delayed recognition in his face was unmistakable. The 2 women looked too similar under the lighting conditions he had observed from. "I got it wrong. he said again, voice so low it barely cleared his lips. Forensics began aligning his statements with every 1995 timeline gap, and every detail Graham gave fit precisely into the spaces the file had left open for 3 decades. Surveillance process, moment of misidentification, approach method, travel route, body disposal site. His confession sealed the cracks no 1990s analysis could ever fill. When the recording ended, only the steady hum of the cooling fan remained. Graham sat there, hands cuffed to the table, no longer trying to add or excuse, and in that quiet space, the truth of Olivia's death, a completely innocent woman, was confirmed by the very words of the man who had once waited in the dark for someone else. Raymond Malloy was cuffed right inside the management office perched at the edge of the Anchorage port, where long rows of containers blocked the wind blowing in from Knik Arm. When the 3 officers stepped through the steel corridor, he only had time to stand up sharply from his desk, his eyes not yet registering any reaction. Documents still lay open in front of him. An unsigned transport report, an inventory sheet, and a thick envelope tucked among the crumpled papers. The office door closed behind them, the lock clicking shut in a short, final snap, cutting off any chance of reaching another communication channel. No staff were allowed near. The investigative team posted guards at both ends of the hallway, preventing any attempt to dispose of documents or pass messages elsewhere. Malloy maintained his familiar calm posture, body slightly tilted as if trying to hold the upper hand, even with his hands locked behind him. One officer read the arrest warrant, voice level, not raised, but each word rang clear in the cold metal space. Though he offered no physical resistance, Malloy turned his head, scanning the room for something. Perhaps the internal phone. Perhaps a document he wanted hidden, or simply the habit of trying to regain control of the atmosphere. But every exit had been sealed before he even stood up. As Malloy was led out of the office, the forensic team moved in immediately to seize documents. On the desk surface, they found a dedicated file box labeled Internal Operations Expenses, containing cash payment receipts matching the time Graham received money. A folded note lay beneath the ledger, with hurried pencil writing, Silver, Audit, End before quarter. The writing wasn't fully faded, as if freshly written during the period when Rebecca began digging deeper into the 1995 payments. That slip of paper couldn't be ignored. Silver matched the description Graham received, audit matched Rebecca's job, and the final phrase clearly suggested a desire to stop it before a financial deadline. In the left desk drawer, forensics discovered an old fax, the same format and paper type as the one found in Graham's garage. The ink had faded, parts obscured by pen strokes. Under green examination light, the original ink emerged stroke by stroke. Graham's phone number, contact timing, and the phrase, same instruction, crossed out. Another fax, untouched by edits, revealed the sentence, need this resolved before month end. The fragments of old paper matched perfectly with the communication method forensics had already established. In the small filing cabinet by the window, the technical team recovered a paper bag of gas receipts, all aligning with Graham's stated travel, Anchorage to Palmer routes, discrete paths, avoiding main checkpoints. The receipts bore no Malloy name, but they were stored in the cabinet exactly where his personal documents were kept, proving they weren't left there by accident. When Malloy was brought into the temporary interview room, he still carried the calm tone of someone who had spent years standing over other employees. He didn't ask why he was arrested. He only said, I want my lawyer. Alyssa sat across from him, opening the forensic file folder, white light reflecting off the shine on the steel table. She wasn't waiting for a confession. She only needed to match each piece of evidence against each reaction. In front of Malloy, she placed the photo of the cash payment receipts transactions with no legitimate recipient. He looked at the paper, but his expression didn't change. Alyssa placed the edited ink fax next. Malloy glanced quickly, then looked away. She placed the photocopy of the note Silver, Audit, End, before quarter. This time, Malloy's eyes lingered longer, though not yet to the point of acknowledgement. When forensics brought in the trace DNA analysis, the room's atmosphere shifted. The second DNA sample, the lighter-colored fiber, matched the Malloy family branch in the direct ancestral line. Forensics explained that this sample showed characteristics consistent with close contact, not directly inflicting injury but present on the coat area where light material transfer occurred before or during victim movement. When the genetic results were placed on the table, Alyssa stated plainly, "This isn't Graham's DNA. This belongs to someone in your family." Malloy stayed silent, but the way he clasped his hands behind his back changed. His knuckles tensed, showing he was calculating an answer. He spoke one short sentence, captured clearly on tape. "I never got near that girl." But forensics didn't need his admission. The DNA didn't speak to timing. It spoke to contact on evidence. And when placed beside cash receipts, beside the edited facts, beside the audit note, every piece formed an outline impossible to distort. Alyssa placed the garage-found photo of Rebecca, the true target of the surveillance. Malloy's hand froze when he saw that photo, not because he recognized Rebecca, but because he recognized the shooting angle, the angle he once stood at while observing cargo entry and exit from the office railing. No one voiced it aloud, but Malloy's glance toward the interview room window showed he was calculating how to explain that coincidence. Alyssa didn't need to press. She only said, "Graham stated you ordered the killing of the woman in the silver coat." Malloy replied immediately, "His word is worthless." But forensics continued presenting the timeline that matched every detail. When Rebecca submitted her internal report, when Malloy approved the irregular payment, when the fax contacting Graham was sent, when Graham received the target description, everything fell within a tight time frame, with no point falling outside the logic of action. Malloy repeated, "I didn't direct anyone to kill anyone." But he couldn't explain the Malloy family DNA on Olivia's coat. He couldn't explain why Graham's gas receipts were in his cabinet. He couldn't explain why the edited facts lay buried under his financial files. He couldn't explain why the pencil note contained a description matching the order Graham received. Every sentence Malloy spoke left a gap that forensics could fill with evidence. Without his cooperation, the connection between money, DNA, documents, surveillance photos, and Graham's statement already shaped the clear structure of the case. Malloy was the one who paid, who provided the target description, who had the strongest motive when Rebecca came close to exposing fraud. When the temporary questioning session ended, Malloy still held the posture of someone convinced denial would protect him. But on the table, the stack of forensic evidence had already said what he couldn't refute. The network of orders, cash flow, and biological traces all led back to Raymond Malloy, the man who once stood behind the Anchorage Bay shore believing he would never leave a trace. The Anchorage courtroom was packed that morning for Graham Caro's trial opening. Overhead lights cast a pale yellow glow across the wooden floor, while the spectator benches filled with reporters, the victim's family, and people who had followed the case since the file was reopened. When Graham was led in, the orange prison jumpsuit made his frame look even stiffer. His eyes avoided every gaze, his steps heavy as though each one crossed uncovered 1995 ground. He sat down, hands resting on the table in front of him, collar slightly creased from his constant downward tilt. The prosecution opened by presenting the reconstruction, a detailed reenactment based on forensic findings and Graham's own statements. On the large screen behind the bench, simulated images appeared. The parking lot under weak light. Thin, drifting snow creating visual noise. A figure in a silver coat stepping through the intersection between two rows of cars, and from the dark area behind, a man moving quickly, closing in, applying the choke in seconds. No sound played in the simulation, only clean, rapid, precise motion, exactly the behavior forensics had confirmed from the ligature marks on Olivia's body. The reconstruction replayed each step Graham had described. How he chose the shadowed position, how he tracked the silver coat silhouette, how he reacted the instant the target entered his line of sight, how he used his left arm to choke while his right hand gripped the shoulder to eliminate noise. On screen, forensics overlaid the curve of applied force, matching the bruising on Olivia's neck, then compared it to the posture Graham described in interrogation. Every movement aligned. When the prosecution called the forensic expert to the witness stand, the courtroom fell so quiet the turning of paper pages rang clear. The expert opened the scene reconstruction report, displayed 3D images, and pointed to three critical factors that caused the misidentification. First was the lighting deficit effect. The half-lit zone made the silver coat reflect intensely, while the face sank into shadow, completely distorting recognition from a distance. Second was snow interference. Wind-driven flakes angled across the view, warping outlines and turning the silver-coated figure into an indistinct moving shape. Third was route overlap. Using surveillance photo data, forensics proved Olivia's path crossed the exact spot Rebecca had appeared on multiple prior days, creating near-perfect visual uniformity with the description Graham received. The entire courtroom watched as the expert played two simulation clips, one under actual parking lot lighting, one under reduced conditions recreating Graham's viewpoint. In the second clip, the silver-coated figure walking the corridor looked almost identical to Rebecca's silhouette from days earlier photos. The expert pointed at the image and stated, "From this angle of observation, the watcher could not distinguish between the two women. Identification time was under 2 seconds. The mistake was a direct consequence of the lighting conditions. No one in the room spoke. The silence felt like a taut sheet of glass stretched between 2 decades and one fatal error." The prosecution continued with the collar DNA results, proving Graham's direct contact with Olivia at the time of the crime. The dark fibers adhering to the fabric matched biological molecules taken from his hair and skin. Forensics read the findings in an even tone, without emphasis, yet each word carried unbendable weight. Another piece was the industrial oil stain on Olivia's shoulder, matching the oil type used in the warehouse where Graham had worked security. The charcoal gray dust analysis was also presented. Its particle structure was identical to dust generated when Graham operated industrial presses in Palmer. The defense attorney questioned the misidentification, trying to frame the case as lack of intent toward this specific victim. The prosecution responded with one sentence: "He still intended to kill a woman." Medical examiners confirmed the choke force was sufficient to cause death in seconds, with no signs of hesitation. The act fully aligned with the purpose of taking life, regardless of whether the victim matched the intended target. Graham's failure to verify identity did not lessen the nature of the act. Forensics proved he operated according to plan, following a specific description, and applied lethal force deliberately. When Graham's turn to speak came, he sat up straight, hands clasped. He looked down before looking up, voice low and hoarse. "I did it because I was paid. I thought it was the person I was told about. I know I was wrong. I can't fix it." No one in the room moved. The confession came not as a plea for mercy, but as something he could no longer keep in his throat. He did not name Malloy. He spoke only of his own actions. Actions forensics had proven undeniable. The judge read the charges, listing the evidence, matching DNA, statements consistent with physical traces, surveillance photos from the garage, forensic reconstruction of the attack path, material samples from the coat, industrial oil and dust, vehicle route, body transport method, and a timeline that aligned perfectly with the reconstruction. As each piece was recited, spectators turned their eyes toward Graham, but he showed no reaction. He only stared at his own wrists, as though the weight of the cuffs was lighter than the weight of his own words. Finally, the sentence was pronounced: life imprisonment without parole. In the courtroom, there were no cheers, no outbursts, only the gavel striking wood. Graham closed his eyes at that exact moment, head bowing forward, as though accepting the end of a chain of actions that had stretched from the snowy night of 1995 to this morning's courtroom. As officers led him from the room, light from the hallway cast a long streak across the floor, slicing his shadow in two. Forensics had brought him here. His confession had sealed the verdict, and the trial through scene reconstruction, lighting analysis, DNA, and his own words had locked in what could not be changed. Graham Caro would spend the rest of his life in an Alaska prison, sentenced by the very traces he once believed would vanish in the snow. The large Anchorage courtroom blazed with light as Raymond Malloy's trial began. Outside, press lined up behind the glass doors. Inside, spectator rows filled with faces waiting to hear how a contract killing buried for 3 decades would be unraveled before the law. Malloy entered in a dark suit, wrists cuffed in metal, yet his hair still neatly combed like a businessman heading to a meeting. He looked straight ahead, head unbowed, eyes never flicking toward the gallery, maintaining the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to standing above rather than sitting in the defendant's chair. When the prosecutor rose, the courtroom atmosphere shifted as though a cold line had sliced across the ceiling. The prosecution did not open with accusations, but with a timeline stretching from 1995 to 2025. On the large screen behind the bench, each milestone lit up in red. The moment Rebecca submitted her report suspecting financial fraud. The moment Malloy signed off on cash expenditures with no legitimate recipient. The moment the fax contacting Graham was sent. The moment Graham began surveilling the woman in the silver coat. The moment Olivia died. And the moment the forensic file was reopened, thanks to new technology. Each milestone was evidence. Each piece of evidence drew a straight line toward the man in the dock. The prosecution presented the first cash payment receipt. The paper had yellowed slightly over the years, but the signature R, Malloy, remained sharp. The amount matched Graham's statement about receiving cash from Malloy to handle it quickly. No business justification explained the expenditure. The prosecutor placed the receipt in the center of the evidence table, then continued with receipts aligning with Graham's travel between Palmer and Anchorage. Those receipts did not stand alone. Forensics had proven they were found in Malloy's personal filing cabinet, not the general archive. Next, the prosecution displayed the old fax recovered from Malloy's office. The fax with text obscured by black pen strokes. Under green examination light, the underlying ink emerged stroke by stroke, revealing Graham's phone number from 1995. Beside it, the phrase, "same instruction crossed out forensics," confirmed the crossing was not fax toner, but pen applied after printing. The entire courtroom stared at the screen as the faded handwriting clarified. Malloy shifted his shoulders slightly, but kept his face composed. The prosecution moved to biological evidence. The lighter-colored DNA sample collected from Olivia's coat, not Graham's, matched the Malloy family branch in the direct ancestral line. Forensics explained the sample indicated indirect physical contact. Someone in the Malloy line had touched an object or surface that later transferred to Olivia's coat before the body reached the port. Malloy could not counter with coincidence, because DNA was not a fingerprint prone to error. It was a sequence of genetic markers that could not occur randomly. When the prosecutor pointed toward Malloy and asked, "Can you explain why your family's DNA appeared on the victim's coat?" Malloy answered only with one short sentence, "I never met that girl," but forensics did not require a direct meeting, only that he handled documents in the auxiliary warehouse, where the oil and charcoal gray dust on the victim's coat were present, and had indirect contact with an object or surface that touched Olivia's coat. The evidence laid on the steel table became words that could not be bent. The prosecution continued with the note, "Silver, audit, end before quarter." Those words became a dagger, driven into the heart of motive. Rebecca wore silver, Rebecca was the auditor, Rebecca was preparing to report financial fraud before quarter's end. Olivia was not the one meant to die. She simply wore the right coat, took the right route, appeared at the right moment. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor displayed the photo of Rebecca recovered from Graham's garage. Next to it appeared the photo of Olivia in the parking lot. The two images projected under dim yellow light created a similarity so chilling it raised goosebumps. The prosecutor said nothing. The images spoke for themselves. When the defense's turn came, Malloy's attorney tried to emphasize that no evidence placed Malloy at the scene, that documents could have been misused, that trace DNA did not necessarily prove Malloy's own contact, but the prosecution needed only one rebuttal. Solicitation of murder does not require presence at the scene. Then the prosecution introduced Graham's statement. "He gave me the money. He said the woman in the silver coat was causing trouble for the company." The statement aligned with the entire chain of documents. To reinforce the argument, forensics presented the cash flow model. Hidden expenditures, unexplained support payments, and lists of outsourced security personnel hired by Malloy but absent from official payroll. Every arrow on the chart converged on Malloy as the central point. When Malloy was finally allowed to speak, he stood, hands on the table, eyes fixed on the judge. His voice was even and firm, without tremor. I did not hire anyone to kill anyone. Nothing in this room proves I gave such an order. But no one was convinced, because right behind him the screen displayed the original facts, the one he believed had been completely obscured by pen strokes 3 decades earlier, now clear in every line. The judge turned through the file, reading the list of forensic evidence. Cash receipts, matching the date Graham received payment. Fax, direct communication with Graham. Note describing the silver coat target. DNA sample matching the Malloy branch. Financial documents Rebecca was auditing. Graham's statement consistent with every piece of evidence. Forensic timeline from 1995 to 2025. No single piece stood alone. They locked together, forming rails that led straight to the director. The sentence was pronounced, the judge's voice ringing through the packed room. Raymond Malloy, sentenced to 65 years imprisonment for solicitation of murder and manipulation of a criminal investigation through evidence tampering. No shouts, no objections. Only the gavel striking wood, one sound echoing through the space, ending 3 decades of concealment. Malloy stood motionless. The composure he had maintained from the start cracked for a single instant when 2 officers placed hands on his arms to escort him. As he was led past the spectator rows, every eye followed in one direction. No longer the image of a powerful heir in Anchorage's transport industry, but the man behind the order to kill in order to conceal financial fraud, the man who finally fell under the weight of forensics, ledgers, and truth that could not be erased with a single pen stroke as in 1995. When the verdict for Raymond Malloy was pronounced, the records room of the Anchorage Police Department received official notification from the prosecutor. All proceedings related to the Olivia Hartman case were complete. In the cold storage room, the 3rd steel cabinet row where the file box 95OH2274 had once lain covered in dust for decades, was opened once more. Not to receive new evidence, but to close a case that had haunted generations of investigators. The file box was placed on the long table, lid lifted, its contents now fitted with a fresh cover layer and a barcode identifier for successfully solved cases. A forensic technician stood before the summary board, marker in hand, writing the final line in the case status section, resolved. Direct perpetrator and directing perpetrator convicted. The final summary report began by listing the reasons the case stretched across 30 years. On the whiteboard at the head of the room, 4 bullet points stood out in bold green ink. Limitations of 1995 technology, evidence tampering, misidentification, leading to misdirected investigation, lack of DNA baseline for comparison. Each point represented a layer of error, not the fault of one individual, but of a system not yet equipped to handle organized crime of this type. Forensics described the 1995 evidence collection process. DNA kit seal misaligned, evidence bag label replaced with different colored ink, dust analysis form missing, and scene evaluation focused solely on the port area, narrowing the investigative direction to port personnel and overlooking the possibility the victim had been at another location. Those errors were recorded in the report as a procedural lesson. A single loose link in the evidence chain could derail an investigation for decades. The next section of the report detailed the role of forensic genealogy in solving the case. On a page clipped behind the DNA profile sheet, each term was explained in detail. Molecular amplification, extended pedigree matching, identification of genetic branches via trace samples, overlaying gen maps with civilian databases. Technicians described how the 2 DNA samples, one dark belonging to the Caro branch, one light belonging to the Malloy branch, created the breakthrough that allowed the file to be reopened. Only through technology that did not exist in 1995 did the 2 faint traces on Olivia's collar become the key to identifying both the direct perpetrator and the one who hired him. Forensics noted one short but critical line. Without genealogical mapping, the case could not have been solved. In the internal APD wrap-up meeting, Alyssa Crane presented to the full team. The large screen displayed the timeline from the moment Olivia left her shift to Raymond Malloy's conviction, each point marked in different colors. She emphasized 3 factors that pulled the case out of darkness: scene reconstruction under actual lighting conditions, trace material analysis, and timeline cross-referencing with Graham's statements. Those three elements interconnected to form the investigative axis, not only identifying who killed Olivia, but why she was killed and who stood behind it. A veteran officer who had worked the case in 1995 stood up, voice low but clear. "We lost too many years because we only looked at the final scene. No one thought the victim had been moved through another stage." He looked down at Olivia's photo placed on the meeting table. A young face in hospital scrubs, eyes calm with the peace of someone who could never know a misidentification had led her to death. He spoke softly, but the whole room heard. "We owed her an answer. Now we have it." As the final report reached its closing section, forensics listed the last pieces of evidence decoded. The industrial oil stain on Olivia's shoulder, matching the oil used in the Malloy transport warehouse. The charcoal gray dust, matching dust from industrial presses Graham once operated. The Civic's abandonment location matching Graham's stated route. The body transport method aligning with drag marks on the coat fabric. Beside it was the cause of misidentification section. Silver coat, light reflection, overlapping roots, snow creating visual noise, and the overly vague target description from Malloy. All factors were presented as a mechanical diagram of the error. At the end of the session, the file box was closed with its steel lid, a resolved stamp affixed to the top right corner, and returned to the cabinet but in a different section. The solved cases area, no longer in the cold case row. A technician added a small card noting the completion date, November 2025. Alyssa stood watching the file box placed into its new slot. There was no applause, no formal ceremony, only the quiet sound of the steel cabinet door closing, the final sound of an investigation that had lasted 3 decades. In the moment the door shut, the Olivia Hartman file 95OH2274 officially left the shadow of unsolved and took its place in APD history as proof of one thing. Forensic genealogy had brought the truth back after time had seemed to erase every trace. The final report ended with the sentence, "File closed. Victim accounted for. Perpetrators convicted." When the verdict for Raymond Malloy was pronounced, the Anchorage Police Department records room received official notification from the prosecutor. All proceedings related to the Olivia Hartman case were complete. In the cold storage room, the third steel cabinet row where the file box 95OH2274 had once lain covered in dust for decades, was opened once more, not to receive new evidence, but to close a case that had haunted generations of investigators. The file box was placed on the long table, lid lifted, its contents now fitted with a fresh cover layer and a barcode identifier for successfully solved cases. A forensic technician stood before the summary board, marker in hand, writing the final line in the case status section, resolved, direct perpetrator and directing perpetrator convicted. The final summary report began by listing the reasons the case stretched across 30 years. On the whiteboard at the head of the room, 4 bullet points stood out in bold green ink. Limitations of 1995 technology, evidence tampering, misidentification leading to misdirected investigation, lack of DNA baseline for comparison. Each point represented a layer of error, not the fault of one individual, but of a system not yet equipped to handle organized crime of this type. Forensics described the 1995 evidence collection process. DNA kit seal misaligned, evidence bag label replaced with different colored ink, dust analysis form missing, and scene evaluation focused solely on the port area, narrowing the investigative direction to port personnel, and overlooking the possibility the victim had been at another location. Those errors were recorded in the report as a procedural lesson. A single loose link in the evidence chain could derail an investigation for decades. The next section of the report detailed the role of forensic genealogy in solving the case. On a page clipped behind the DNA profile sheet, each term was explained in detail. Molecular amplification, extended pedigree matching, identification of genetic branches via trace samples, overlaying gen maps with civilian databases. Technicians described how the 2 DNA samples, one dark belonging to the Caro branch, one light belonging to the Malloy branch, created the breakthrough that allowed the file to be reopened. Only through technology that did not exist in 1995 did the 2 faint traces on Olivia's collar become the key to identifying both the direct perpetrator and the one who hired him. Forensics noted one short but critical line. Without genealogical mapping, the case could not have been solved. In the internal APD wrap-up meeting, Alyssa Crane presented to the full team. The large screen displayed the timeline from the moment Olivia left her shift to Raymond Malloy's conviction, each point marked in different colors. She emphasized three factors that pulled the case out of darkness: scene reconstruction under actual lighting conditions, trace material analysis, and timeline cross-referencing with Graham's statements. Those three elements interconnected to form the investigative axis, not only identifying who killed Olivia, but why she was killed and who stood behind it. A veteran officer who had worked the case in 1995 stood up, voice low but clear. "We lost too many years because we only looked at the final scene. No one thought the victim had been moved through another stage." He looked down at Olivia's photo placed on the meeting table. A young face in hospital scrubs, eyes calm with the peace of someone who could never know a misidentification had led her to death. He spoke softly, but the whole room heard. "We owed her an answer. Now we have it." As the final report reached its closing section, forensics listed the last pieces of evidence decoded. The industrial oil stain on Olivia's shoulder, matching the oil used in the Malloy transport warehouse. The charcoal gray dust matching dust from industrial presses Graham once operated. The Civic's abandonment location matching Graham's stated route. The body transport method aligning with drag marks on the coat fabric. Beside it was the cause of misidentification section: silver coat light reflection, overlapping routes, snow creating visual noise, and the overly vague target description from Malloy. All factors were presented as a mechanical diagram of the error. At the end of the session, the file box was closed with its steel lid, a resolved stamp affixed to the top right corner, and returned to the cabinet but in a different section. The solved cases area, no longer in the cold case row. A technician added a small card, noting the completion date, November 2025. Alyssa stood watching the file box placed into its new slot. There was no applause. No formal ceremony. Only the quiet sound of the steel cabinet door closing, the final sound of an investigation that had lasted 3 decades. In the moment the door shut, the Olivia Hartman file 95-OH2274 officially left the shadow of unsolved and took its place in APD history as proof of one thing. Forensic genealogy had brought the truth back after time had seemed to erase every trace. The final report ended with the sentence: "File closed. Victim accounted for. Perpetrators convicted." When the file box 95-OH2274 was moved into the solved section, APD began to recognize impacts that extended far beyond a single case. In many closed-door meetings across the Anchorage Police Department, senior investigators from various units were summoned to hear the first technical presentation on the full range of errors in the Olivia case. Projected on the screen was the series of once-overlooked evidence: misaligned DNA kit seal, relabeled evidence bag, missing dust analysis form, damaged shoe print photography, and an investigation narrowed by incorrect final scene assessment. All were connected into a chain not to assign blame to anyone, but to show how a contract killing could hide for decades behind tiny procedural gaps. Right after the wrap-up session, APD reviewed more than 40 cold cases involving suspected victim relocation or target misidentification. Old file boxes were brought down to the steel tables, dust-covered case numbers reappearing under the examination room lights. Cases once thought to be random attacks were now viewed differently. The possibility of a contract killing gone wrong with the wrong target. The list of cases for re-examination grew into a comprehensive chart covering an entire wall, each case marked with its own symbol indicating suspicion level. Many younger investigators, who had never handled a murder-for-hire with mistaken victim, saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Vague target descriptions, surveillance of the wrong person, staged scenes to mislead, and faint evidence, due to technology of the time being insufficient for trace reading. Over the following weeks, forensic genealogy became the central tool. Old DNA samples were pulled from sealed storage, each kit re-examined with next-generation trace reading systems. Faint DNA samples from the 80s and 90s were scanned, as though searching for family branches once impossible to identify. Technicians accustomed to traditional DNA models now began working with extended pedigree maps, combining ancestral data with distant relative chains. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. The Olivia case had opened a door the Alaska investigative community could no longer close. At the federal level, a hundreds of pages technical report was sent to the FBI. The report focused not only on forensic conclusions but detailed the entire 1995 error chain: evidence collection timing, improper storage procedures, inadequate scene photography, lighting, misclassified evidence placement, and especially the one-dimensional final scene assumption. Everything was presented in layered timelines: evidence layer, behavioral layer, processing error layer, and investigative consequence layer. The FBI received the report as a warning about how murder for hire could hide behind mistaken crime assumptions, especially without technology to trace DNA sources. Upon receiving the report, the FBI held an internal federal judiciary seminar. The meeting room screened the dim light reconstruction, the simulation recreating the conditions that caused Graham to mistake Olivia for Rebecca. Investigators from multiple states watched and discussed the possibility that senseless victim cases from the 80s and 90s might actually be misdirected contract killings. The presentation turned the Olivia case into a national case study, clear proof that vague target descriptions in contract killings always carry deadly misidentification risk, and that modern forensics can unravel it even after decades. The biggest lesson recorded: murder for hire does not always follow a clear intentional template. When the target is described simply, silver coat, fixed route, fixed time, the chance of error rises sharply if the killer does not verify identity. And that error, as in Olivia's case, does not reduce the responsibility of the directing party, because the motive to eliminate remains intact. This was the point the FBI noted in their response letter to APD, along with a request to share forensic results for reopening federal files in other states. Back in Alaska, APD began overhauling evidence storage procedures statewide. Old cabinets were replaced with temperature-controlled vaults. Every DNA kit received an electronic identifier, tracked by automated systems instead of handwritten labels. Body cameras became mandatory for every step of evidence collection, from scene to storage. New investigators were trained using the Olivia model as foundational practice: how lighting can distort identification, how evidence tampering can derail direction, how timelines can collapse if even one DNA sample is overlooked. In the full department wrap-up meeting, the APD chief spoke to the packed room. The 1995 mistakes no longer sit in the dark. They have been written out, re-examined, corrected, and we will not let similar cases repeat. Some investigators who had worked the Olivia case in 1995 sat in silence, but their eyes carried a hard-to-name relief. They had lived nearly 30 years with this file. Now, seeing the true motive and true perpetrators brought to light was the only way to place a final period. In the cold case section, where a long row of boxes once read unsolved, many were moved to the under re-examination area. Faint DNA samples were placed under next-generation analysis systems, in hopes that once obscure distant genetic branches might now become keys. A young forensic technician stood before the molecular analyzer and said quietly, "If Olivia opened this door, maybe we'll find many other victims too." The statement wasn't meant to dramatize tragedy, but to point out that one case could change how an entire system reads the past. In the final section of the APD report sent to the prosecutor, one line was printed in bold: "The Olivia Hartman case shows that mistaken target killing in murder for hire is not an isolated incident, but a crime pattern that can recur under poor lighting, incomplete target descriptions, and weak evidence oversight procedures." And beside that line, the very last part of the file stated clearly: long-term impact, comprehensive overhaul of evidence, storage procedures, standardization of trace DNA testing, expansion of forensic genealogy, training in target identification for organized crime. That was how the Olivia file, a case that began with a mistake in the snow, became a lesson for the entire Alaska investigative community to step into a new chapter, The story of Olivia Hartman is not just a criminal file solved after 3 decades. It clearly reflects issues American society still faces today. The fragility of individuals before small flaws in systems, hasty decisions that can steal innocent lives, and the importance of technology, transparency, and personal responsibility in a vast and complex nation. Olivia was killed by mistake simply because of a vague description woman in a silver coat, and because weak parking lot lighting made her image too similar to Rebecca's. This detail reminds us that in everyday life, a single piece of incomplete information can lead to serious misunderstanding, from security decisions, identification, to hasty judgments in communities. Malloy's manipulation of documents, relabeling of evidence, and use of company power to conceal wrongdoing also reflects a challenge Americans face today. How to build a culture of transparency in workplaces, recognize risks when power goes unchecked, and encourage individuals to ask questions as Rebecca did. The 1995 investigative misdirection, faulty DNA kit seal, damaged shoe print photography, misplaced evidence, serves as a reminder of professional responsibility in any American field, from policing, healthcare, engineering to technology. A single small error in the chain can lead to consequences lasting decades. Yet at the same time, APD's persistence and the power of forensic genealogy highlight a vital lesson. Scientific progress and human tenacity can correct mistakes, restore truth, and deliver justice, even when time seemed to have erased every trace. In modern life, whether protecting personal data, reporting workplace misconduct, or simply exercising caution in decisions that affect others, Olivia's story reminds us that accuracy, transparency, and accountability are never luxuries. They are the foundation that helps a large society like the United States stand firm against flaws that could ruin innocent lives. If you believe stories like Olivia's need to be told to keep us vigilant and trust in the power of justice, please hit subscribe to join us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video where we continue opening files that seem to have slept quietly, but still carry lessons for the present.